She disembarked with an old suitcase, a few coins, and nowhere to go. He owned thousands of acres, a vast herd of cattle, and a magnificent mansion. But for years he hadn't known how to call it home. A man who had forgotten how to live. A woman with nothing to lose. And a harsh winter was about to force them both to the brink of survival. Please like and comment the name of the city you're viewing. I want to know how far this story has come. Chas. The train didn't slow down for Redstone Valley so much as it grudgingly surrendered to it. Vivian Ashcroft felt the brakes bite before she heard them. A long metallic groan working its way through the passenger car like a complaint from something old and tired. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass and looked out at the town coming into view. It wasn't much. A main street that ran maybe 4 blocks before it gave up entirely. A handful of storefronts, their painted signs faded from too many seasons of wind. A livery stable, a general store, a saloon with a broken shutter that banged rhythmically against its frame in the October gusts. Beyond the town, the land opened up enormous and flat and indifferent in all directions, brown grass rippling like the surface of something breathing. She pulled her coat tighter across her chest, though it didn't help much. The coat was too thin for this latitude, and she'd known that when she boarded the train 2 days ago, and she hadn't had a better option. The other passengers were already standing, pulling bags from the overhead racks, buttoning collars and smoothing jackets. A heavy-set man in a wool suit shot a glance at Vivian's single suitcase, battered brown leather with a brass clasp that had been repaired twice with wire, and then looked away without expression. She was used to that. The look that cataloged you in about 3 seconds and filed you somewhere between inconsequential and unfortunate. She stood, lifted the suitcase herself, and moved toward the door. The platform was windswept and half empty. A boy of maybe 12 was wheeling a luggage cart with loose wheels that clattered against the planks. 2 older men in ranch coats stood near the station house, talking with their hands deep in their pockets, watching the train the way people watch things that don't entirely concern them. A woman in a heavy wool dress was collecting a package from the freight car, arguing quietly with the freight handler about something regarding the weight. Vivian stepped down from the car and set her suitcase on the platform. She stood still for a moment, just to get her bearings. The wind hit her full in the face, carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly metallic, like iron or cold stone. The sky above was a hard, pale blue with no warmth in it whatsoever. She could feel November in it already, even though it was only the 2nd week of October. "You here for the Blackstone position?" She turned. A woman in her late 40s was standing a few feet away, arms folded across her chest, looking at Vivian with the frank assessment of someone who had very little patience for evasion. She was stocky, weathered, with gray-streaked hair pinned back severely, and brown eyes that didn't miss much. "Yes," Vivian said. "Housekeeper posting in the paper." "That's right." The woman studied her for another moment. "I'm Ruth Caldwell. I run the dry goods store 2 blocks up. My husband Edgar drives the supply wagon for Blackstone Ranch twice a week." She paused. "I also happen to know every woman who's answered that advertisement in the past 3 years. 4 of them. None lasted longer than 6 weeks. Vivian held the woman's gaze. "I appreciate the warning." Ruth's expression didn't soften, but something in it shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "Wasn't a warning, was information. There's a difference." She glanced at the suitcase. "You need a ride out to the ranch? Edgar's heading that way this afternoon." "I'd be grateful." "Oh." The road to Blackstone Ranch took 40 minutes by wagon, and Edgar Caldwell spent most of those 40 minutes in silence, which suited Vivian fine. He was a lean, sun-darkened man with enormous hands and a habit of squinting at the horizon as though checking it for problems. He drove well, easy on the horses, reading the road without appearing to think about it. The country they moved through was harsh in the way that commanded respect, whether you offered it willingly or not. The grass had gone brown and stiff. The occasional cottonwood stood bare along the creek beds. In the distance, a line of low hills marked the edge of the valley, and between here and there stretched what must have been 10,000 acres of working land, fenced pasture, plowed earth, winter wheat barely showing, cattle visible in loose clusters near water troughs. "How long have you driven for Blackstone?" Vivian asked, around the 20-minute mark. Edgar glanced at her sideways. 8 years. "Is he a fair employer?" The man was quiet for a moment. He's exact, he finally said. Doesn't ask more than what he agreed to pay for. Doesn't give less, either. Doesn't ask personal questions. Doesn't answer many, either. He paused. Fair enough, I suppose, depending on what you're used to. Vivian nodded and looked out across the land. He lost his wife, Edgar added after another silence. Helena, 7 years back. Fever took her in about 10 days. He wasn't home when it happened. He was up north closing a deal on a timber contract. He said this without any particular drama, the way men like him stated facts. He came back and she was already buried. Folks say he never quite... He stopped himself. Well, that's probably enough. Probably, Vivian agreed. The ranch came into view gradually, revealing itself piece by piece the way impressive things often did. First, the fencing. Substantial, well-maintained, running along the road for nearly half a mile. Then the outbuildings, a long barn painted deep red, a hay storage structure enormous enough to swallow most houses, a smithy with smoke rising from its chimney, a series of workshops and sheds in various states of busy purpose. Cowboys moved between the buildings with the deliberate efficiency of people who had too much to do before dark, and then the mansion. It was not what she had expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. Something she could dismiss more easily, perhaps. Something that made the position feel smaller, and therefore less frightening. Instead, it was 3 stories of dark stone and timber, flanked by a wide front porch, with tall windows that caught the pale October light and threw it back cold and flat. It wasn't pretentious. It didn't have the ornamentation of wealth trying to announce itself. It had the solidity of something built to last, and not terribly interested in whether you appreciated it. The surrounding grounds were neat, the gravel drive raked, the fence posts straight, nothing visibly broken, but not tended, not cared for. There were no flower beds, no window boxes, nothing that suggested someone lived there who wanted to. The place looked like what it was, the headquarters of an enterprise. Not a home. Edgar pulled up in front and brought the horses to a stop. He didn't get down. Someone will come out, he said. Someone did. A woman in her 50s, thin-boned and quick-moving, came down the front steps with the expression of a person perpetually managing more than she'd agreed to. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patton, head of household staff, which currently meant herself, 2 younger maids, and a cook who came in 6 days a week. Mr. Blackstone is in the East Barn, Mrs. Patton said, giving Vivian's coat and suitcase the same cataloging look the man on the train had given them. He said to get you settled and he'll speak with you at dinner. She turned and went back up the steps, clearly expecting Vivian to follow. The room they gave her was on the 2nd floor, at the back of the house. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the paddock, and beyond it, the wide flat brown of the land stretching south. The fireplace was unlit. The wardrobe held extra blankets on the top shelf and nothing else. Vivian set her suitcase on the bed and opened it. She had 3 dresses, underclothes, a pair of work boots she'd worn halfway through, a wool shawl, a small framed photograph of her mother that she placed on the washstand, and a dog-eared novel she'd been reading for 2 months without getting past page 60 because she was always too tired by the time she had the quiet to read. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, pressed her hands flat on her thighs. She was 27 years old. She had spent the previous 4 years working as a housekeeper and later a household manager for the Whitmore family in Albany until Mrs. Whitmore's death and the subsequent dissolution of the household. Before that, she had worked as a seamstress. Before that, she had been her mother's caregiver for 2 years until the end. She had no family remaining. She had savings enough for 3 months, maybe 4 if she was careful. She had answered the Blackstone advertisement because it was the only position that offered room and board alongside wages, and because 3 other positions in more convenient locations had already been filled by the time her letters arrived. She was here because she had run out of other options. She didn't spend much time feeling sorry about that. She opened the wardrobe, placed her extra dress inside, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Patton and ask where she could begin. Dinner was at 7. She gathered that from Mrs. Patton and confirmed it from the cook, a heavy-set man named Horace, who had been preparing meals for the ranch for 11 years, and who received her introduction with the specific wariness of someone who had watched housekeepers come and go often enough to stop investing in the new ones until they'd proven staying power. You cook? He asked, without looking up from the pot he was tending. Passably, she said. I'm not here to take your kitchen. He looked up at that, studied her for a second, then went back to the pot. Fair enough, he said, which she suspected was about as warm as Horace got with strangers. She spent the hours before dinner walking through the house, not intrusively. She didn't open closed doors or explore rooms that clearly weren't in use. She simply moved through the spaces that were common to the household and tried to understand the shape of the place. What she found was a kind of organized neglect that wasn't the result of laziness or poverty, but of something more specific. The main rooms were kept clean, the floors swept, the surfaces dusted, the fireplaces cleared, but nothing was maintained in the deeper sense. A curtain rod in the parlor was bent and hadn't been straightened. A window latch in the dining room didn't catch properly, letting in a thread of cold air that would be unbearable by January. The pantry off the kitchen was organized, but not efficiently. Winter stores in front, frequently used items behind them, a system that had grown by accumulation rather than intention. The mansion was clean, but it was not cared for. There was a difference, she had learned. Clean was what you did when you didn't want to see the problem. Cared for was what happened when someone had decided the place was worth the investment of attention. No one had decided that here in a while. See, she heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps. The house was stone and timber, and his footsteps didn't carry. But the back door to the kitchen opened, and Horace's posture changed slightly, becoming more precise, and that told her something had shifted in the room's hierarchy before she turned around. Damian Blackstone was not what the journey had led her to imagine. She had assembled a rough picture from Edgar's words and the general silence of the landscape, something imposing and remote, all hard lines and deliberate coldness. The reality was both more ordinary and more complicated. He was tall, lean-muscled in the way of men who did physical work daily rather than maintaining it for appearance. Dark hair gone gray at the temples. A face that had been exposed to too many seasons of sun and wind and wasn't apologetic about it. He was still in his work clothes, canvas trousers, a heavy flannel shirt, a vest that had seen better years. His hands, when he set his hat on the hook by the door, were the hands of a working rancher, scarred at the knuckles, capable, weathered to a kind of permanent roughness. He looked at her directly, not the cataloging look she'd been getting all day, not assessing her clothing or her luggage or her prospects, just looking, the way a man looks at a new situation he's trying to understand. Miss Ashcroft, he said. His voice was even, not warm but not cold either, neutral in the way of someone who had learned not to waste tone. Mr. Blackstone. Did they show you the room? Yes, it's adequate, thank you. Horace will go over the household schedule with you tomorrow morning. Mrs. Patton handles the staff roster. I'd like meals at 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening. Midday, whatever's available. He paused. The position pays $12 a month plus room and board. If that's different from what the advertisement stated, now's the time to say so. The advertisement stated 10, she said. I increased it. No explanation. He said it the way a man states a correction to an arithmetic error. She nodded. Then we're in agreement. He moved to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Horace already had soup on the table and bread, and there was a place set across from him. For her, she understood, though no one had told her she'd be eating at the main table. She took the seat without making anything of it. They ate in silence for the first several minutes. Not uncomfortable silence, exactly. More like the silence of two people who were each trying to understand what the other was going to require of them, and neither one particularly inclined to rush the assessment. You've done this kind of work before, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, 4 years in Albany, large household, full staff. Before that, smaller positions. Why'd you leave Albany? The family dissolved the household. The woman I worked for died. He absorbed that. Any family of your own? No. Another silence. I'm going to be direct with you, he said, setting down his spoon. He looked at her with the same straight attention he'd used when he walked in. I've had 4 housekeepers since Mrs. Patton reduced to part-time. None of them lasted. 2 left because the work was harder than they expected. 1 left because she wanted something from this position that the position wasn't offering. He paused. I'm not looking for someone who wants to transform this house into something it isn't. I'm looking for someone who can manage what needs managing and leave well enough alone. Sorry. Vivian looked at him. What does leave well enough alone mean to you specifically? He seemed slightly surprised by the question. Not offended, but recalibrated. It means I don't need anyone trying to fix things that aren't broken. And the things that are broken? He was quiet for a moment. Within reason, he said finally. That's a reasonable answer, she said, and went back to her soup. She started the next morning at 5:30, not because anyone asked her to, because the kitchen fire needed to be going by 6 if breakfast was to be on time, and Horace didn't arrive until 6, and the two maids, sisters named Clara and Beth, who were 17 and 19 respectively, and had been working at the ranch for less than a year, were responsible for fires in the main rooms but hadn't been told about the kitchen. She noticed this the first morning and simply went down and lit it herself. By the time Horace arrived, there was a pot of water on and enough kindling stacked by the iron stove to last through the morning. He looked at the fire, then at her. I'll add this to the morning list, she said, unless you'd prefer to handle it differently. He considered her with the wariness he'd started with, plus something new layered underneath. That's fine, he said. She spent that first week doing what she'd done in every new position, learning the shape of the place before she tried to change any of it. She watched how the staff moved through the house, where they lost time, where they doubled back unnecessarily. She watched how the morning meal reached the ranch hands, a long walk from the kitchen to the bunkhouse mess, in whatever weather, carrying pots that were lukewarm by arrival. She watched how the pantry got restocked, which happened on whatever day the supply wagon came, rather than according to any plan related to what was actually running low. She watched how Mrs. Patton and Horace communicated, which was mostly through Clara and Beth, who carried messages between them like a telegraph system that introduced errors at both ends. She made notes in a small book she kept in her apron pocket. Not a long list, just enough to remember what she'd seen. At the end of the first week, she went to Mrs. Patton with 3 suggestions, not presented as criticism, as adjustments. The first was a simple change to the supply list so that quantities were tracked weekly instead of restocked on arrival. The second was a covered cart she proposed they use to transport breakfast to the bunkhouse, which would keep things warmer and reduce the number of trips. The third was a standing weekly conversation between herself, Mrs. Patton, and Horace, 15 minutes on Monday mornings, to flag anything that needed addressing before it became a problem. Mrs. Patton listened with the careful attention of someone assessing a threat. You're not trying to manage me out of a position, the older woman said. No, Vivian said. I'm trying to make sure we're not duplicating each other's work or stepping over each other when we don't need to. Mrs. Patton was quiet for a moment. The covered cart is a good idea. Horace has been complaining about the cold walk for 2 winters. She folded her hands in her lap. We'll try Monday mornings. Damien Blackstone noticed none of this, or seemed not to. He was up before dawn and rarely returned to the house before dark. When their paths crossed, he was brief and civil and moved on quickly, a man with too many legitimate demands on his attention to spend any of it on conversation that wasn't necessary. But things changed incrementally, and he noticed those. The window latch in the dining room stopped letting in cold air. She'd had Edgar bring a new latch from town. The curtain rod in the parlor was straight. The pantry, which had required 10 minutes of excavation to find the salt barrel, now had the most frequently used items at the front and a written inventory on the inside of the door. None of these things were large. None of them required his approval or his money or his attention. They just quietly improved the texture of the house he lived in. He said nothing about them for 2 weeks. Then one evening, coming through the kitchen for a cup of coffee before bed, he stopped and looked at the revised supply shelf. Reordered, labeled, practical in a way the previous chaos had never been, and turned to where Vivian was sitting at the kitchen table going over the week's household accounts. How long did that take you? He asked. She glanced up. About an hour. He looked at it another moment. He said, and poured his coffee and left. She counted that as progress. The town was harder to warm up. Redstone Valley had an opinion about Vivian Ashcroft before she'd been there long enough to give them one. She was young, too young for a serious housekeeper, the older women said. She was attractive, Too attractive for a woman who claimed to want nothing more than steady work, the men said, not always charitably. And she was a stranger, which in a frontier town the size of Redstone Valley meant she carried a deficit of history that took years to pay down. She went into town for supplies twice in her first 3 weeks, with Edgar, and she heard the whispers without having to try. At the dry goods store, Ruth Caldwell served her with professional courtesy and no warmth. At the post office, the postmaster's wife found a reason to linger and ask questions, very politely, very indirectly, about what the household was like, and what Mr. Blackstone was like, and what Vivian hoped to do after this position, which contained within it the implication that the position would be ending soon. She answered everything straightforwardly, without volunteering information she didn't need to volunteer. On her third trip to town, she was in the general store when she overheard 2 women talking near the back shelves, not bothering to lower their voices particularly. Can't imagine she's actually here to clean house. Woman looks like that, coming all the way out here. Well, he's rich enough, can't blame her for trying. 4 years younger than his wife would be at least. He'll come to his senses eventually. Vivian set her purchases on the counter. The store owner, a Mr. Greer, looked slightly pained. He was the kind of man who didn't enjoy conflict, but also didn't do anything to stop it. She looked at him and said clearly enough that the women could hear, "Can I get 2 pounds of lard and a packet of needles, please? The large ones, for canvas work." He wrapped her order. She paid, picked up her package, and walked out. She didn't respond to the women directly. Not because she didn't have things to say. She had about 4 different responses available, most of them sharp enough to land. But because she understood by now how these things worked. You didn't win these conversations by winning them. You won them by making the conversation irrelevant through the passage of time and the weight of evidence. People change their minds slowly and under pressure of observable fact, and not for any other reason. She had time. She would give them facts. What began to shift her standing in town wasn't anything dramatic. It was that she paid attention. She'd done this all her adult life. It was something she'd developed out of necessity in positions where she had no institutional authority, only the authority she could build from understanding the landscape around her. She remembered names. She remembered details. When Ruth Caldwell mentioned during one supply run that her youngest son had been throwing up for 3 days, Vivian came back the following week with a small bundle of dried ginger and peppermint she'd packaged herself, because those had settled her mother's stomach during illness. Ruth received this with visible surprise and said nothing much about it, but the following week she was slightly less professionally courteous and slightly more like a person actually speaking to another person. She learned that the widow Norris, who lived on the eastern edge of town, had lost her husband in an accident the previous spring and was managing a small farm alone with 2 sons, ages 8 and 11. That the Pearson family's roof had collapsed on one side the previous winter and they'd been managing with a temporary patch that wasn't going to hold another season. That old Mr. Hewitt, who had ranched for 40 years and whose hands had given out on him, refused any offered help because he had too much pride to let himself be seen as the kind of man who needed it, and so he was quietly going without things he needed. She stored all of this and said nothing about it to anyone, but when she came to Damien with the household accounts at the end of October, a brief weekly meeting he'd insisted on, 20 minutes, practical and businesslike, she set the accounts on the desk and then said, "There's something else I want to mention." He looked up. "The Pearson family's roof," she said. "The temporary patch they put in last January won't hold the winter. They've got 3 children. I don't know if you're aware." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware of the Pearsons." "Do you know about the roof?" Another pause. "No." She nodded. "I just wanted to mention it. It's not my business to tell you what to do with the information." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read entirely, and then went back to the accounts. 3 days later, Edgar Caldwell's supply wagon made an extra run into town, carrying a quantity of lumber and roofing materials, and stopped at the Pearson farm. She heard about it from Clara, who'd heard it from Beth, who'd heard it from someone in town. Nobody mentioned Damien Blackstone by name, but the timing wasn't a coincidence. She didn't bring it up. November arrived with the decision to make itself known. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 4 days. The sky took on the specific low, heavy quality that people who had lived in the valley long enough recognized as a waiting sky, holding something back, accumulating pressure, not yet ready to release it, but not going to hold forever. The old hands on the ranch began saying things like bad feeling about this one and worse than last year, maybe. Damien was already reading the signs himself. She saw it in the way he moved through the ranch with more urgency, the conversations with the foreman growing longer and more technical, the shipments he was ordering, hay, grain, salt, medical supplies, in quantities that his own men thought were excessive. One evening, after dinner, he sat at the dining table with a paper in front of him and didn't eat much. She was about to take the dishes to the kitchen when he said, without looking up, "You've heard the talk about the weather." "Some," she said. "What do you think?" She wasn't sure if he wanted her opinion or was simply thinking aloud. She took a chance on the former. "I think the instinct to over-prepare is almost always cheaper than the cost of being caught short," she said. "If you're wrong, and the winter is mild, you have extra supplies. If you're right, you've protected people and property. The asymmetry favors caution." He looked up at that. "You think in terms of risk." "I think in terms of consequences," she said, which isn't quite the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at the paper. "I'm ordering another 200 bales. The men think I'm overreacting." "Then let them think that," she said, and took the dishes. What? By the end of the third week of November, every warehouse on Blackstone Ranch held more than it had ever held at this time of year. The hay was stacked deep. The grain stores were full. The medical cabinet, a point she'd raised with him directly, saying the existing stock was 3 years old and needed updating, had been restocked. Extra blankets and oilskins were bundled in the supply room near the back door, easy to reach, ready to load onto wagons. The ranch hands had stopped complaining about the extra work and started getting a particular quiet look about them. The look of people who didn't know yet that they'd be grateful. She watched Damien move through all of this, directing, deciding, pushing hard against the pressure of days shortening and the sky pressing lower. And she thought about what Edgar had told her on the road in. He was up north closing a deal on a timber contract. He came back and she was already buried. She thought about what it did to a person, to be elsewhere when the worst thing happened, to come home to a done fact, something beyond argument, no chance to have been there, no chance to have done anything differently. She thought about how you'd live with that, and whether the answer might look something like building walls so high that nothing could get inside without advance warning, whether it might look like knowing, with obsessive certainty, exactly where everything was, and whether it was adequate and what the contingency plan was for every conceivable failure. She understood this because she recognized it. Not the specifics, she had not lost a spouse, but the underlying logic of it. The way catastrophe teaches you to scan constantly for the next one. The way you learn to mistake vigilance for safety. She didn't say any of this to him. She wasn't sure it would help. But she worked alongside the vigilance rather than against it, and she thought that was probably the right call. The storm came on a Thursday. She woke at 4 in the morning to a sound she'd never heard before. A low, continuous pressure against the north wall of the house. Not quite wind and not quite silence. Something in between that was somehow worse than either. She got up and went to the window and pressed her hand against the glass and found it cold as iron and shaking slightly in the frame. Outside, she could see nothing. No paddock, no barn, no horizon. The world had been replaced with white, moving fast and without direction. She dressed quickly, pulled on her heaviest layer and went downstairs. Damien was already in the kitchen. He was dressed and had his coat on and was drinking coffee standing up, looking at the window with the focused attention of a man trying to read something that didn't have a readable face. Horace wasn't in yet. She'd be surprised if Horace made it in at all today. Clara and Beth lived on the ranch grounds and would be in, but not yet. She went to the stove and started water. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad," he said. "The drifts by the east fence are already 4 feet. Main road will be impassable by dawn." He set down the cup. "I need the men organized before full light. We've got livestock to shelter, fence lines to check, and—" He stopped. "There are families in town without adequate fuel." "I know which ones," she said. He looked at her. "I've been paying attention," she said simply. "I can give you a list. In order of urgency." He stared at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it, or maybe something more complicated. Then he said, "I'll get the foreman." "I'll get the list," she said. By the time gray light began to show, which was less light and more a different shade of the dark, the ranch was already moving. She'd written the list in 15 minutes. 8 families, organized by need, households with children under 5, elderly residents living alone, households with compromised roofs or fires that couldn't be trusted. Widow Norris, the Pearson family with the recently repaired but still uncertain roof, old Hewitt, who would refuse help but needed it. 3 families on the South Road she'd learned about through accumulated town knowledge, who had sick members, whose husband had been laid up with a broken leg since September, whose winter supplies had run short already. She gave the list to Damien. He read it without speaking, then handed it to his head foreman, a tall, quiet man named Reeves, with clipped instructions. This order: every wagon loaded before they go. Mrs. Ashcroft will specify what each household gets. He left. Reeves looked at her. Tell me what you need on each wagon, he said. She told him. The ranch became something she'd never seen before. Men who'd been cowpunchers and fence riders and stable hands moved with the urgent precision of people who understood, all at once, that the specific skills of their working life had become the skills a community needed to survive. They loaded wagons in the dark with numb hands, guided horses through drifts that came to the animals' chests in places, navigated roads that had disappeared under white and had to be found by memory and instinct. She stayed at the ranch, not because she couldn't go, she would have if it had helped, but because the ranch was where the decisions were being made, where the supplies were organized, where the information was coming in. Reeves sent riders back with reports. She organized them. Which roads were passable? Which families had been reached? What was needed that hadn't been sent? What was running low in the supply room? Horace managed to make it in at 7, battling through 100 yards of drifts from his quarters, and immediately started on enough food to feed every man twice over. Clara and Beth arrived pale and wide-eyed and were set immediately to work wrapping supplies, organizing blankets, heating soup. Vivian moved between them all, not shouting, not dramatizing. She gave directions quietly and specifically, and people followed them because they were specific enough to be useful, and because in a crisis, useful is the only kind of authority that actually works. Damien came back at midday, frost in his beard, and his coat stiff with cold, long enough to drink something hot and report. South Road is clear enough for single wagons. North Road is bad. A drift collapsed over the Harlow property fence, and we've got cattle loose. Reeves is handling it. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. The boarding house on Mill Street, Mrs. Tanner's place. I went by. The snow load on the north roof it's not good. She's got 4 people in there, including a woman with a newborn and a boy maybe 6. Can she move them? I want to. She's afraid to. He rubbed a hand over his face. I'm going back. I'll go with you, Vivian said. He looked up. It's not... I know what the roof sounds like when it's going to give, she said. I grew up in a house with a bad roof. You'll need someone to listen while you're looking. He studied her for a moment, then said, Get your coat. The boarding house was on the edge of the main street, a 2-story frame building that had probably been solid 30 years ago. Now Vivian could see, even through the blinding white curtain of the storm, that the north-facing roofline had developed a visible bow. Snow was still falling, heavy and wet, and the load was growing. Inside, the temperature was better than outside, but not much. Mrs. Tanner, a small, frightened woman in her 60s, met them in the front hall with the expression of someone who had been trying very hard not to let the fear show, and had mostly succeeded. I can hear it, she said, the creaking. Vivian went to the back of the ground floor and stood still, listening. The house had a voice. All old houses did, and a bad roof spoke in a particular register. A low, intermittent groan, like something under sustained pressure. Not the settling sound of wood adjusting to cold, something under load that the structure wasn't designed for. She came back. The east side of the north roof, she said to Damien. It's not going to hold past this afternoon. He nodded once, turned to Mrs. Tanner. We need to move everyone to the south rooms, on the ground floor right now. And then I want you and everyone else out within the hour. But where? The ranch, Vivian said before he could. There's room. Horace has soup on. Your guests won't be warm immediately, but they'll be warm. Mrs. Tanner looked at her. Something in the woman's face, not quite relief, Not yet, but the beginning of it. The first movement toward letting go of the fear. All right, she said. Go on. They got them out in 40 minutes. The young mother with the newborn, her name was Alice, 20 years old, still shaky on her feet from the delivery a week before, had to be helped down the stairs and across the street to the wagon. Vivian walked beside her, one arm around the woman's waist, talking to her quietly. Just a few more steps, the wagon's right there, your baby is fine. Look, she's bundled. She's fine. The 6-year-old boy, whose name was Thomas, was holding his mother's hand with both of his and was being braver than he had any particular right to be at his age. He didn't cry. He just kept his eyes fixed on whatever was directly in front of him and put one foot after the other. Damien lifted him up into the wagon without being asked and set him in next to his mother. They were a block away when it happened. The sound reached them before the sensation of it. A deep, wrenching crack that cut through the noise of the storm, followed by a sustained collapse, a cascade of impacts. They turned and saw the east side of the boarding house roof give way. Not all at once, but in a sequence of failures, each one pulling the next, snow and timber and shingles coming down in a collapsing curtain. The room they had been in 20 minutes ago no longer had a ceiling. The boy. Thomas said nothing. He watched it happen with his eyes very large, and then he looked up at Damien, and Damien looked back at him, and neither of them said anything at all. The wagon started moving. By nightfall, 12 people from the town were sleeping at Blackstone Ranch. The main parlor had been converted. Pallets on the floor, every spare blanket, the fire going as high as Vivian judged safe. Horace had been cooking for 6 hours straight and showed no sign of stopping. Clara and Beth moved through the space with the flustered efficiency of girls discovering for the first time that they were capable of more than they'd thought. Damien came in for the last time at 10 o'clock at night. He was exhausted in a way that showed in how he moved. Not slow, but careful, like a man managing structural fatigue rather than just physical tiredness. He stood in the doorway of the parlor and looked at the room. Mrs. Tanner was asleep in the chair near the fire. Alice and her baby were on the best pallet, near the warmest wall, which was where Vivian had put them. Thomas was asleep with his head on his mother's arm, still in his coat. She brought Damien a bowl of soup and a piece of bread and sat across from him while he ate. He didn't say anything for a long time, just ate and looked at the room. Then he said quietly, "Your list saved 6 hours today, maybe more." "You had the supplies to use," she said. "That was you." He shook his head slightly. "Half of those families on your list, I didn't know about. The Norris widow? Hewitt. I knew Hewitt had too much pride to ask for anything, but I didn't know he was that short on fuel." He paused. "How did you know?" "I pay attention," she said. "And people tell you things when they're not being asked questions. They just talk, and if you listen, it adds up." He looked at her. That expression again, the one she couldn't quite name. Something held back but present, like a window with the light behind it and the curtain drawn. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. Just that. Then he finished the soup, set the bowl down, and went to check on the livestock. She sat with the sleeping room around her and thought about what it cost a man like him to say something like that. Quite a lot, she suspected. And the fact that he'd said it anyway, that she thought, was probably the most significant thing that had happened all day. The 12 people who'd slept on pallets in Damien Blackstone's parlor were gone by the second morning after the storm. Not all at once. The roads cleared in stages, the main street first, then the side roads, then the outlying properties. And people left as the paths became passable, in ones and twos carrying borrowed blankets back to their own homes, with the particular quietness of people who had needed help and were processing the experience of having accepted it. Mrs. Tanner was the last to go, on the afternoon of the second day, after Damien had sent 2 men over to assess the boarding house damage and report back on what could be salvaged. The east side of the upper floor was a loss. The rest was structurally sound. She stood in the front drive of the ranch in her heavy coat and looked at Vivian with an expression that had several things competing inside it. "I don't know how to—" she started. "You don't need to," Vivian said. "Go home and get warm." Mrs. Tanner pressed her hand once, quickly, and then walked to the wagon Edgar had arranged to take her back into town. Vivian watched the wagon go and then went inside to start on the parlor. The pallets needed to be broken down, the blankets washed, the room put back to order. She'd done harder things. She set to it. She was halfway through folding the second stack of blankets when Clara appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee in each hand with the tentative look of someone testing whether an offering was welcome. "Thought you might want one," Clara said. "Thank you." Vivian took it. Clara didn't leave immediately, which was new. The girl usually moved through the house with quick, efficient invisibility, speaking when spoken to and not otherwise. Now she stood with her own cup and looked at the room they were dismantling and said, without apparent connection to anything, "My mother always said you could tell a lot about a person by what they do when nobody's watching." Vivian looked at her. "What made you think of that?" Clara shrugged, color coming slightly into her face. "Nothing, just everything this week." She went back to the blankets. Vivian drank the coffee and didn't say anything, but she thought about it after. The small recalibrations that happened around her lately, Clara speaking up, Beth laughing more freely in the kitchen, Horace offering opinions on the household schedule without being asked, Reeves stopping to explain his decisions rather than simply issuing orders to the men below him. She hadn't done any of that directly. She hadn't sat any of them down and explained that things would be different now. It had just accreted. The way things changed when the atmosphere of a place changed, when the standard of how people were treated began shifting almost imperceptibly towards something more like dignity. She didn't know if Damien had noticed. She suspected he had. The aftermath of the blizzard settled over Redstone Valley like a long exhale. The damage was real but manageable, mostly roof lines, fences, a stretch of the North Road that had undermined on one side and needed regrading come spring. 3 farms on the valley's eastern edge had lost significant sections of their winter hay stores when storage roofs gave way under the weight. 2 of the elderly residents Vivian had flagged on her list had come through the storm in poor health and needed ongoing attention during the weeks that followed. She tracked all of it. Not because anyone asked her to, but because tracking was how she thought. And once you'd watched a community struggle through something like that storm, the natural next question was what it would take to make sure they were less exposed if it happened again. She began writing things down in a second notebook, separate from the household accounts, separate from the supply lists. She wasn't sure what she'd do with it yet. She just wrote. Damien noticed the notebook the way he noticed most things she did, quietly, without immediately commenting. They were eating dinner on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the storm, and she'd set it beside her plate because she'd been adding to it earlier and hadn't yet returned it to her apron. He glanced at it. She moved it to her other side, not as a concealment, but just to clear the table, and he said, "What's that one for?" "Observations," she said. "About the household?" "About the valley." She picked up her fork. "Things I noticed during the storm. People in situations that came close to being much worse than they were. I'm thinking about what could be different." He was quiet for a moment, cutting his meat. "Different how?" She'd been waiting for an opening like this, and she didn't rush it. "Better distributed emergency supplies," she said. "Not here, necessarily. Something more central, something the whole town could access. And some kind of early warning system for vulnerable households, so that when bad weather comes, someone already knows who needs to be reached first and in what order." He looked up. "You're describing an infrastructure problem." "I'm describing a people problem," she said. "The infrastructure follows from knowing which people are at risk. I've been collecting that over the past 2 months." He put his fork down and looked at her with a directness that she'd learned, by now, to read as his version of genuine attention. Damien Blackstone expressed very little externally, but there were gradations, and full attention had a specific quality, a kind of stilling, like a man who'd stopped managing several things at once and was focusing on one. "Show me the notebook," he said. She passed it across the table. He read through it without speaking. She ate and let him read. After about 10 minutes, he closed it and set it back on her side of the table. Hewitt lost 40% of his hay because his east storage roof was failing and he wouldn't tell anyone, he said. He mentioned it to Edgar in passing 3 weeks before the storm, she said. Edgar thought he was speaking generally about the building's age, not about a specific structural problem. If I'd known, he wouldn't have accepted the help directly, she said. But you could have sent men to do maintenance work in that area and let it be incidental. Some people need the choice to not quite ask. He absorbed this. You know that from experience. I know it from paying attention to how pride works, she said, which is the same thing, I suppose. They finished dinner in a silence that was different from the silences they'd started with. The early silences had been neutral, the quietness of two people with no established language between them yet. This one had texture. Things unsaid, but not because they couldn't be said, more because they didn't need to be yet, and both of them were comfortable enough with that to leave it alone. December arrived, and with it the specific rhythms of a working ranch in deep winter. The days shortened to almost nothing. The cold settled in with a permanence that stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like landscape. The ranch hands moved between buildings with their coats pulled high, conversation shortened to the minimum necessary. The social gravity of the bunkhouse growing stronger as the outside world shrank. Vivian learned the winter rhythms and adjusted to them. She'd adjusted to harder things. What she hadn't adjusted to, entirely, was the way the ranch felt different in December than it had in October. She'd arrived to a place that was functional but hollow. Now, slowly, without any single moment she could point to, it had become something else. The kitchen was louder. Horace had started making bread twice a week instead of once, and the smell of it moved through the ground floor of the house in a way that seemed to encourage people to linger. Clara had started decorating in small ways. Nothing significant, just a few pine branches on the mantel, a wreath on the back door. And nobody had told her to or told her not to, and so she had, and the house looked lived in because of it. Even the evening meals had changed. In October, Damien had eaten quickly and left. Now he stayed longer. He didn't talk much more, say. He was not a man who would ever be described as talkative, but he was present in a different way. He asked Horace occasionally about the bread, which was how Horace learned that Damien had a specific preference for a particular kind of rye loaf his mother had made, something he'd never mentioned to anyone because nobody had ever asked. He told Vivian this, slightly embarrassed about the specificity of the preference, and she told Horace, who started making it once a week. These were small things. She knew they were small. But small things, accumulated, were how places changed. The town's attitude toward Vivian shifted in the weeks following the storm, though not uniformly and not without resistance. Ruth Caldwell was the first to cross what Vivian thought of as the line from courtesy to something genuine. She came into the dry goods store one morning in late November, and Ruth came out from behind the counter, actually came around, which she never did, and said without preamble, "My youngest is better. The ginger worked." "Good," Vivian said. "Also," Ruth stopped, compressed her mouth slightly, as though the next words were being pushed out against some resistance. "I heard what you did during the storm. The list. Organizing the wagons." "I made a list," Vivian said. "Damien Blackstone organized the wagons, and his men drove them. He had the wagons because of those warehouses he filled." Ruth's eyes were direct and unapologetic. "And he knew who to send them to because of you." "We both did," Vivian said. "It wasn't one person's doing." Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't disagreement either. "I was hard on you when you got here," she said, very directly. "You were careful," Vivian said. "There's a difference." Something in Ruth's face softened almost imperceptibly. "You sound like me," she said, which, coming from Ruth Caldwell, Vivian understood was probably the most significant compliment available. Not everyone adjusted as readily. There was a particular subset of the town's women, led in practice, though not by any formal appointment, by a Mrs. Genevieve Halloran, whose late husband had been a county surveyor and who had, therefore, by some logic Vivian couldn't entirely trace, acquired the social authority of a person whose husband had owned something important, who continued to view Vivian's position at Blackstone Ranch through the lens of their initial interpretation and found that lens extremely difficult to set down. The storm hadn't changed Mrs. Halloran's opinion so much as it had driven it underground, where it expressed itself through the small, persistent friction of social exclusion. Not quite invitations that arrived too late to attend, conversations that pivoted slightly when she approached, a specific quality of politeness that was indistinguishable from dismissal if you weren't looking for the difference. Vivian was looking. She'd learned to look. She didn't fight it. She didn't try to force her way into rooms that didn't want her. She understood that some reputations were built the slow way, and she had time, and she had work, and that was enough. What she didn't entirely anticipate was the effect of all of it on Damien, not the town's shift, which he noticed with something like quiet satisfaction. She could read it in the way he talked about town business now, with more engagement, less of the deliberate detachment of a man who had decided the community was something to support financially rather than belong to. That shift she'd expected. She'd watched it building. What she hadn't quite anticipated was the specific way he began talking to her, not more frequently. He was still not a man who wanted conversation for its own sake, but differently. There was a quality to some of their evening exchanges now that had moved outside the practical and into something she didn't have a clean word for. He asked what she thought about things, not household things, actual things, matters of judgment, how to handle a conflict between two of his foremen, whether a proposed deal with a neighboring ranch on shared water rights was fair to both parties, what she made of the county commission's new land registration requirements, and whether they'd help smaller ranchers or hurt them. He'd never asked Helena these things. He'd told her. That much she'd pieced together from the shape of what he left out, the specific gaps in how he talked about his wife. Helena had been warm, adored by the ranch hands, the kind of person whose death left a physical absence you could walk around and feel on your skin. But they had not been equals in the way he was beginning to treat Vivian as an equal, and she thought, sometimes, that he was either discovering something for the first time or rediscovering something he'd forgotten was possible. She was careful about this. She was careful because she could feel the thing between them, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather comes. And she did not know yet what kind of weather it was. She had her position to think about, her practicality to think about. There were a dozen good reasons not to let herself move toward anything she couldn't manage. She managed herself by staying busy, which she was anyway, and by not examining things too closely, and by reminding herself regularly that she was an employee and that what she felt in rooms when he walked into them was not a reliable source of information. This worked moderately well. January brought a stretch of cold that wasn't dramatic like the blizzard, but was more relentless in its way. The kind of sustained freeze that sapped energy gradually, made everything harder by increments, wore people down not through any single catastrophic event, but through the daily accumulation of small hardships. Pipes froze. Horses had to be checked more frequently. The supply runs Edgar made became more complicated as road conditions degraded and improved unpredictably. The ranch hands were tired in a way that showed in their faces by the third week of January. Not sick, just worn. The bunkhouse evenings were quieter than usual. The easy camaraderie that characterized those spaces when things were going well, replaced by the particular silence of men who were too tired for conversation. Vivian noticed this on a Sunday when she walked past the bunkhouse on her way to check the root cellar inventory. She could hear, or rather not hear, the difference. She stood outside for a moment, in the cold, with her coat pulled tight, and thought about what she knew of the men. Their names, most of them now. Who came from where? Who had family they didn't see enough? Who had been sick last fall and hadn't quite come back to full strength? She went to Horace the next morning. "I want to do something different for Sunday evenings," she said. "A proper supper. Not just what there is, and something made for it. Enough for the whole crew, ranch hands included." Horace looked at her over the counter where he was working. "That's 40-some people." "I know, I'll help." He was quiet for a moment, calculating something. Not just the logistics, she thought, but whether this was a decision she had the authority to make unilaterally. Which was fair. She didn't, strictly speaking. "Let me check with Mr. Blackstone," she said. "But I'm asking you first because I want to know if it's possible before I tell him it's possible." "It's possible," Horace said, with the tone of a man who appreciated being consulted before being volunteered. "Need more flour and lard, and I'd want 2 of the hands to help with the carrying." "I'll arrange it." She went to Damien that evening. He was in his office, a room at the back of the house that she'd learned to read as a place where he went when he needed to work without interruption, which was different from a place where he wanted to be interrupted, and she'd become reasonably fluent in the distinction. Tonight the door was half open, which was the signal for interruption being acceptable, and she knocked on the frame. He looked up from the desk where he was going over ledgers. The lamp was low, and there were shadows under his eyes. He'd been pushing hard all through January, out early and back late, the grind of winter ranch work layered on top of the ordinary weight of running an enterprise the size of Blackstone. "Sunday suppers," she said from the doorway, "for the full crew. Proper meals, something Horace makes for the occasion. Not a party, just a better end to the week. The men are wearing down. He looked at her for a moment. How much? I'll work it out with Horace and Edgar. It won't break the household budget. That's not what I meant. How much more work for you? She was slightly surprised by this. Some, she said. I don't mind. You're already doing more than the position requires, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. More like an observation he'd been sitting on and decided to let out. I've noticed. I do what the household needs, she said. The household, he said very precisely, needs you to not run yourself into the ground in January when we've got 2 months of winter left. She looked at him. Do the Sunday suppers, he said. But I want another person assigned to help you, not just with the cooking. Anything else on the household side that needs extra hands, ask for them. All right, she said. That's all, he said, and went back to the ledger. She went back down this hall, and it took her a moment to realize that what she was feeling was something uncomplicated. She was glad he'd said it, not because she'd needed the permission or the help, necessarily, just because he'd paid attention. The Sunday suppers changed the bunkhouse the way yeast changes dough. Not immediately, not dramatically, but fundamentally. The first one was a roast with root vegetables that Horace was particularly proud of, carried over in covered pots with 2 of the youngest hands assigned to help, and the crew received it with the specific silence of men who hadn't expected something good and were recalibrating. By the third Sunday, the crew was talking through dinner in the way tired men talk when they've been given a reason to stop moving for an hour. Stories started coming out. Arguments, the good-natured kind, about which territory produced better horses or which winter was worse than this one. A man named Castro, who had worked the ranch for 6 years and almost never said anything beyond what was necessary, turned out to have opinions about cattle breeding that were both strong and extremely well-informed, and these opinions generated a 3-Sunday argument with a man named Breckenridge that the rest of the crew attended with interest. Reeves told Vivian in passing that morale was the best it had been in January for several years running. She nodded and said she was glad, and went back to what she was doing. She did not say, I know, I planned for that, partly because it would have sounded self-serving, and partly because she understood that the credit for things like this should distribute evenly or not at all. The men had done the warming themselves. She'd just set the conditions. Oh, Damien found her in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening in late January, sitting at the table with the second notebook and the household accounts spread between them and a cold cup of tea at her elbow she'd apparently forgotten about. He said nothing about this. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down across from her, and looked at what she was working on. Reading anything useful? He said, nodding at the notebook. I'm thinking about spring, she said. The families who lost hay stores in the storm, they're going to be short coming out of winter. Some of them won't be able to afford replacements at spring prices. I know. Do you have a plan for that? He looked at her. I'm working on one. I have some thoughts, she said, if you want them. I generally want them, he said, which came out with a directness that surprised both of them slightly. He moved on quickly. Tell me what you're thinking, she told him. It wasn't complicated. An arrangement where the ranch could offer hay at the previous fall's prices to farms that had documented losses from the storm, with payment deferred to the summer if needed. The terms would be fair and clearly stated. It would cost Blackstone something, but not excessively, and it would prevent the kind of downward spiral that started when small ranchers lost 1 year's margin and couldn't recover. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities as a listener. When she finished, he turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. The deferred payment is the part that'll give people trouble, he said. Not the offer, the accepting it. Pride. That's why it needs to be framed as a business arrangement, she said, not charity. It's a purchase contract with specific terms. People can sign a contract. People can't always accept a gift. He looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this more than today. I think about things for a while before I bring them to you, she said. There's no point in taking your time with an idea I haven't worked through. I wish my foreman thought the same way, he said, with the dry understatement she'd come to recognize as his version of humor. Half of them come in with a problem and a strong opinion about it, and no idea what the next step looks like. Reeves doesn't. Reeves is the exception. He paused. We'll draw up the contract language. I'll have the attorney in town put it in proper form. And I want your name on the letter that goes out to the farms. Not mine. She blinked at this. Why? Because you know these families, he said simply. A letter from me is from the biggest rancher in the county. A letter from you is from the woman who came out in the blizzard and knew where everyone was and what they needed. Those are two different letters. She looked at him. There were things she might have said. She didn't say most of them. All right, she said. He nodded, finished the coffee, and stood to leave. At the kitchen doorway, he stopped. She thought he was going to say something specific. She'd learned to read the particular quality of the pauses before he said something he'd been considering longer than the conversation had been going on. But he just said, "The tea's cold." She looked at the cup. "I know." "There's more in the pot," he said, and went. She sat in the kitchen for a moment after he'd gone, listening to the house settle around her. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the wind was doing its February preview in January, pushing hard at the north windows. The ranch breathed around her, enormous and functional and alive in all the ways it had not been when she'd arrived. She thought about the letter that would go out to the farms, her name on it, his idea to put it there. She thought about a man who, according to every account she'd gathered in 4 months, had been systematically pulling away from the world for 7 years, building distance the way other men built walls, and who was now sitting across a kitchen table from her and asking what she thought, and putting her name on business documents and telling her the tea was cold. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She poured herself fresh tea and went back to the notebook. But February came in and stayed. The cold didn't break. The roads were passable but unpleasant, the kind of winter travel that was technically possible but cost more than it looked like it should. Edgar made his runs. The supply wagon went back and forth. The ranch continued its grinding, relentless, unglamorous winter work. Then there was the matter of the Farrow brothers. They arrived on a Wednesday. 2 men from out of the valley, one of them a lawyer from the county seat named Harlan Farrow, the other his younger brother Cleet, who managed several properties on Harlan's behalf. They came to discuss, they said, a potential arrangement for a piece of land on the ranch's southern boundary. They were professionally courteous and very well dressed for the weather, and had an air about them that Vivian identified immediately as the air of men who had arrived having already decided something. She was in the hallway when they came in, moving between the parlor and the back of the house, and she saw them before they saw her. She watched Reeves show them to the sitting room to wait for Damien. She watched the way Harlan Farrow surveyed the room when he thought nobody was watching, quickly, cataloging, the way a man surveys a room when he's assessing something about the owner. She went and found Damien before he went in to meet them. "I don't know them," she said, "but I want to say something before you go in." He looked at her with that specific attention. "Go on." "Watch what the younger one does while the older one talks," she said. "Men who arrive in pairs where one talks and one watches, the one who watches is usually the one whose opinion actually matters about the thing they've come for." He studied her for a moment. "You got that from the hallway?" "From the way the younger one looked at the room before he sat down," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, and went in. She didn't hear what was discussed. She wasn't meant to. But Damien came to her that evening after dinner with the expression of a man recalibrating an assessment. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the space between them for a moment. "The land they wanted," he said. "There's a spring on it. They mentioned it once, quickly, like it wasn't the point. But Cleet Farrow looked up when they mentioned it." "Was it the point?" "Probably," he said. "That spring feeds 3 miles of irrigation on the east farms. I didn't build on that parcel specifically because of it." He paused. "If they'd gotten it and redirected the water rights, who do the east farms belong to?" "Smallholders, 4 of them, including the Norris widow." Vivian said nothing for a moment. "The Farrow brothers are likely to try again through different channels," Damien said. He wasn't asking her exactly, but he wasn't not asking. "Then the East Farms need to understand clearly what that spring means for them," she said. "If they know its value, they're harder to approach separately and quietly. You can't buy a water right out from under people who know they have one." He nodded slowly. "I can talk to the farms directly if you want," she said. "Have the conversation plainly, not as your representative, say, as a neighbor." He looked at her. "You'd do that." "I already know all of them," she said. "It's less alarming coming from someone they've already met." "All right," he said. "Yes." She reached for her notebook. He watched her write something. not readable from where he sat, just the scratching of a pen, the beginning of another list. "Vivian," he said. She looked up. He was quiet for a moment, and the pause had that quality again. The considered one. The one she'd learned to wait through. Outside, the wind was finding the gaps between the windows and the frames with its usual persistence. The fire popped. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand what you do here is more than what we agreed to. And that I—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm not going to pretend I don't see it." She looked at him steadily. "All right," she said. "That's all," he said, which was becoming, she realized, his specific way of ending things he didn't know how to extend. He stood up. She watched him go. There was a particular quality to the feeling she had sitting in that kitchen at that hour, with February pushing at the windows and the notebook open on the table, and the sound of a house that had learned how to breathe again after a long time not doing so. It was not simple. It was not clean. It had edges in it that she wasn't ready to examine directly. But it was, underneath everything else, the specific feeling of a person who has found the thing that justifies all the difficulty of getting there. She closed the notebook, pushed back from the table, and went to check the stove before bed. She visited the 4 East farms over 3 days in the first week of February, riding out with Edgar on his regular supply runs and walking the last distance herself, when the roads narrowed to tracks too uncertain for the wagon. The Norris farm was first. May Norris was 34 years old and looked it in the way that women who worked land alone looked their age. Not badly, not without grace, but without any of the softening that came from having someone else carry half the weight. She came to the door of the farmhouse when she heard the approach, wiping her hands on her apron, and when she saw Vivian, she did the thing that most people in the valley had stopped doing. She looked genuinely glad. "Come in out of that wind," she said. The farmhouse was small and very clean, the kind of clean that required constant effort and expressed a specific kind of pride. The 2 boys, Franklin, 11, and Joseph, 8, were at the kitchen table doing schoolwork, which they abandoned instantly at the sight of a visitor. May sent them back to it with the particular authority of a woman who was also the only disciplinarian in the household and had learned not to negotiate. They drank coffee. May's was strong enough to strip paint, which Vivian drank without comment. "I know about the Farrow brothers," May said, before Vivian had managed to introduce the subject. She said it the way someone says a thing they've been sitting with for a few days, waiting for the right time. "Harlan Farrow came here himself in November, said he was interested in buying the southern parcel. I told him it wasn't for sale. He asked what it would take to make it for sale." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that me telling him it wasn't for sale was the answer to that question." May set down her cup. He smiled. That kind of smile where the man's already decided you're not the final decision maker. Vivian looked at her. "He'll come back." "I know. And when he does, he may not come as himself," Vivian said. "He may send someone you don't recognize or approach it through the county land registry with a technicality you didn't know existed. These kinds of men are patient." May was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around her cup. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the south wall of the farmhouse and made itself known. Franklin looked up from his arithmetic. "What does he want with that parcel?" May said. "The spring," Vivian said. "The one that feeds the eastern irrigation. Your parcel, the Halverson claim, the Briggs land, and the old Sutton property all share water from that spring. If any one of you sells, whoever owns it can file to redirect the water rights. The others would be farming dry ground within 2 seasons. May absorbed this with the stillness of someone who had been hit by enough things that she'd learned not to show the impact immediately. Then she said, "Does Mr. Blackstone know all of this?" "He does. The hay arrangement he offered you in January, the contract pricing. That wasn't coincidence. He's been watching this longer than I have. He could have said something. He's not a man who explains his thinking until he has to," Vivian said. "I've learned that about him. I don't think he means it unkindly. He just assumes people don't want to be bothered with the details until the details become a problem." May looked at her for a long moment. "And you think the details are about to become a problem?" "I think it's better to know now," Vivian said. "While there's still time to do something other than react." May nodded slowly. She refilled both cups without asking and sat back down. "Tell me what I need to know," she said. "The The Halverson claim was run by a man named Gunnar Halverson, 61 years old, who had emigrated from the North Country as a young man and retained from that origin a directness in conversation that bordered on bluntness and an almost complete imperviousness to being managed. He received Vivian in his barn, where he was repairing tack, and listened to what she had to say without stopping his work. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. The barn smelled of leather and hay and cold air and the particular animal warmth of the two horses in their stalls at the far end. "Farrow," he said. "I know that name. County seat lawyer." "Yes." "He sent a man out here in October, younger fellow, said he was doing a land survey for the county and needed access to the south field. He put down the section of bridle he'd been working on and looked at her directly. I let him through because I didn't know what he was doing. Now I do." "What he was doing was establishing the survey record," Vivian said, "building a paper foundation. It's a common approach. Get the documentation in place before the offer. So if you ever need to contest something in the land registry, you already have recorded visits." Halverson's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You know about land law?" "I know about how people work around it," she said, "which is related but different." He picked the bridle back up. "My son wants me to sell this place and come west," he said, not as a non sequitur. She could hear the connection he was making. "He's been saying it for 2 years. If someone made an offer that looked reasonable, he'd say I should take it. Is that what you want?" "I want to die on land I worked," he said simply. "Same land." He paused. "My son means well, but this is mine." "Then you need to know it's yours to defend," she said, "and that you don't have to defend it alone." He looked at her over the bridle. "Why is Blackstone interested in helping us?" "He's got enough land." "Because if those water rights get redirected, the East Farms fail," she said, "and then someone buys them cheap, someone who already has the water. And Blackstone Ranch ends up with a neighbor who is considerably larger and considerably less neighborly than 4 small farms." She paused. "He's a practical man. He understands that neighbors matter." Halverson made a sound that might have been a dry laugh. "Practical," he said. "All right." She left him with a written summary of the water rights situation. She'd prepared 4 of them, in plain language, with the relevant registry numbers, and walked back to the road to find Edgar and the wagon. The Briggs land and the old Sutton property took up the rest of the second and third days. The Briggs were a young couple, Oliver and Dora, married 4 years, with a daughter who'd just turned 2, who were still in the optimistic phase of frontier farming, which meant they hadn't yet had a year bad enough to teach them what bad years cost. They listened to everything Vivian said with the attentiveness of people encountering a problem they didn't know they had, and were accordingly more frightened by it than May Norris or Halverson, who'd had years of problems to calibrate against. Oliver Briggs asked good questions. He was a careful thinker, and his first response to concerning information was to try to understand it completely before he did anything with it. If we wanted to put the spring itself into some kind of shared registry, list all 4 properties as dependent on it, would that make it harder to reassign the water rights to a 5th party? He asked. Vivian paused. She hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms. "I think it might," she said slowly. "It would require a unanimous consent provision for any change to the water allocation. One person couldn't sell their water rights without the agreement of the others." "You'd want a lawyer to set it up," he said, "properly." "You'd want Damian Blackstone's lawyer," she said, "because the attorney the Farrow brothers work with is probably also the county's primary land registry lawyer, and you don't want the same man drawing up documents for both sides of this." Oliver nodded. "Could you ask him?" "I'll ask him tonight," she said. The Sutton property's current occupant was an older man named Delacroix, who had leased the land from the Sutton estate for 11 years since old Matthias Sutton's death, and whose situation was the most complicated of the 4. He didn't own the land, only leased it, which meant that if the Sutton estate received an attractive enough offer, Delacroix could find himself without a farm, regardless of what the water rights situation looked like. He knew this. He'd known it for 11 years and had built his life around the knowledge, the way you build a house around a crack in the foundation, working with it, not pretending it wasn't there. "I'm not the vulnerable party," he told her, with the specific accuracy of a man who had thought hard about his situation. "The estate is. Whoever administers the Sutton estate is who Farrow needs to reach." "Who administers it?" "A cousin in Philadelphia. I've never met her. We correspond twice a year about the lease payment and nothing else. Do you know if she's been contacted about the property? He looked at her. I wrote to her in November after a man came asking questions about the land. She wrote back saying she'd had an inquiry from a law firm but hadn't responded yet. He paused. I told her not to respond without telling me first. I don't know if she listened. Vivian was quiet on the ride back. Edgar let her be quiet, which was one of his better qualities. The wagon moved through the frozen afternoon, the horse's breath coming in clouds, the countryside brown and white and very still. She was thinking about the architecture of what Harlan Farrow was building. It was patient work, this kind of thing. Survey records in October. Visits to the farms in November. The Sutton estate in Philadelphia. 4 separate approaches, each looking unrelated, each one a brick in a structure that wouldn't show its full shape until it was largely complete. By then, contesting it through the county registry would be expensive, slow, and dependent on a legal system where Farrow had relationships and they did not. The practical thing was to move faster than him on the elements that could be moved. The joint water registry that Oliver Briggs had suggested, the Sutton cousin in Philadelphia, and whatever formal document Damien's attorney could draw up that made the 4 farms' relationship to that spring a matter of official record before Farrow's survey became the only record anyone had looked at. She had it organized by the time Edgar pulled the wagon into the ranch drive. Damien was in the office when she came in. The door was half open. She knocked. He looked up from the ledger. There was something in his face that registered her arrival in a specific way that she'd noticed over the past month. A kind of settling, like a man who'd been bracing for something and could let it go. She didn't know what to do with this and had taken to not looking at it directly. She sat down across the desk and told him what she'd found. He listened the way he always listened. Still, no interruptions, the full weight of his attention placed on the person talking. When she'd finished, including Oliver Briggs's idea about the joint registry, he was quiet for a moment. That's a better solution than anything I had, he said. It was Briggs's idea, she said. I want to be accurate about that. I know. You just told me. A pause. I'll wire Thomas Greer tomorrow. His attorney in the county seat, she knew the name from the hay contracts. The joint registry first, because that's the thing that protects the water regardless of what happens with the Sutton estate. The Philadelphia cousin, that one concerns me. Me too, she said. If Farrow has already made her an offer, she may have already accepted one in principle, he said, in which case we're trying to unwind something that has momentum. He picked up a pen, set it down. I need to write to her directly, not through an intermediary. You don't know her? No. But I can write a plain letter explaining the situation, not a legal letter, that would alarm her and push her toward her own attorney, who may be connected to Farrow for all we know. Just a letter from a neighboring rancher explaining what the land is worth, why, and what the consequences of a particular sale would be for people she's never met. He looked at Vivian. Though I suspect it would be better coming from you. You have more credibility as a landowner, she said. You have more credibility as a person, he said, which was delivered so directly and without ornamentation that she wasn't sure for a second that she'd heard it the way it was meant. But she had. She could tell from the way he'd already moved on, looking down at the desk. We'll both sign it, she said. That way she gets both. He nodded. Come back here after dinner. We'll draft it. Tab. They drafted the letter at the desk in the office, with the lamp turned up high, and snow beginning to come down outside the window. Not a storm, just a steady, quiet snow that muffled the world outside. He wrote the first version, and she read it and crossed out 2 paragraphs and rewrote them. He read her rewrites and changed 3 sentences. She read the changes and left 2 of them and changed 1 back. At some point, Horace appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee that nobody had asked for, set them on the edge of the desk without speaking, and left. They looked at the cups, then at each other. He does that, Damien said. I know, she said. I think he's decided we need supervision. Something crossed his face that was recognizably a smile, rare enough that she'd catalogued each one. He's probably right, he said, and went back to the letter. They finished it at close to 10 o'clock. It was direct and specific and human in tone. Not legal, not formal, but plain in the way that plain things were harder to dismiss than complicated ones. It explained the spring and the irrigation and the 4 families and what the water represented to people who had built their lives around it. It asked the Sutton cousin to delay any decision and accept a phone call or visit before proceeding. It made clear, without being threatening, that there were resources and people in Redstone Valley who would support a fair resolution. Vivian read the finished letter through one more time. "It's good," she said. "Better than what I had alone," he said. "Better than what I had alone too," she said, which was honest. He folded the letter and sealed it. Then he sat back in the chair and looked at her across the desk with an expression she was getting better at reading. Not the practical attention, not the focused rancher assessing a problem, but the other one. The one that had no operational purpose that she could identify. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "When you came here," he said, "in October, what were you expecting?" She thought about this genuinely because it deserved a genuine answer. "Work," she said. "Steady work, room and board, enough to stabilize and decide what came next. And the position, as you found it, was it what you expected?" "No," she said. "What was different?" She considered. "I expected a household that needed managing," she said. "What I found was a household that had stopped believing it was worth managing. That's a different problem, and a harder one." She paused. "The supply lists and the pantry, those took an afternoon. The rest of it took longer." "The rest of it," he repeated. "The people," she said. "What happens when people stop feeling like what they do matters?" She looked at him steadily. "You included." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a statement that had been received and was being sat with. "I know what people in town said when you arrived," he said finally. "What they said about why you were here. What they implied about your intentions." "I know too," she said. "Does it still bother you?" "Less than it did," she said. "Some of those people changed their minds. Some of them didn't. I've stopped spending energy on the ones who didn't." "Mrs. Halloran hasn't changed her mind," he said, with that dry undercurrent. "Mrs. Halloran's mind is very settled," Vivian said. "I've made my peace with that." He almost smiled again. "You're better at making peace with things than I am." "You're better at holding positions under pressure than I am," she said. "We're different kinds of stubborn." This time he did smile, briefly. It changed his face considerably, and she thought, not for the first time, that it was unfortunate he did it so rarely. Sat. March came in indecisively, the way March did in the valley, alternating between days that promised spring and nights that reminded you how much winter still had left to say. The snow melted in patches on the south-facing slopes and refroze at night into treacherous glass. The cattle were restless. The horses were irritable. The ranch hands were beginning to show the particular edge of men who had been cooped up too long and were itching for the work that only open ground permitted. Thomas Greer, Damien's attorney, made the trip from the county seat in the second week of March. He was a careful, bespectacled man of about 50 who spoke precisely and billed by the quarter hour, and had the manner of someone who had spent long enough in the law to be genuinely alarmed by the things people thought they could get away with. He met with Damien and Vivian together. This, she understood, was Damien's decision, and she'd accepted it without comment because commenting on it would have made it into something it didn't need to be yet. Greer laid out the joint water registry option as Oliver Briggs had conceived it. He described it as unusual but legally sound and possibly precedent-setting for the county, which he seemed to find interesting in a professional way. He also had news about the Pharaoh situation that he delivered in the measured tones of a man who was practiced at delivering information that might make people angry without himself becoming a target of the anger. Harlan Pharaoh filed a preliminary survey claim on the Sutton parcel with the county registry in January, he said. Standard procedure for an interested buyer. It establishes formal interest without committing to a purchase. But the timing suggests he had a conversation with the estate before we sent that letter. Had the cousin responded to him? Vivian asked. His firm indicated interest on her behalf, though no offer has been formalized. Greer looked at both of them over his glasses. Here's the complication. The survey claim he filed references the spring. Specifically, he's already laid the groundwork to argue that the spring is primarily associated with the Sutton parcel, and therefore the water rights move with that land. Damien was very still. That's not accurate. It's arguable, Greer said, which is the point. He's not trying to be right. He's trying to create an argument that takes 6 months and $1,000 to contest. Most small landholders don't have the patience or the money for that. We do, Damien said. Yes, Greer said, which is why you're the person he'd least like to be on the other side of this. He paused. The joint registry, if all 4 landholders agree and we file it immediately, predates his survey claim as a formal record of shared water dependency. It won't eliminate his argument, but it substantially weakens it. Get the papers drawn, Damien said. How long? If we move quickly, a week. Then the 4 landholders sign. Then we file. Vivian was already thinking. Delacroix is the problem, she said. He doesn't own the land. He can't sign for the Sutton parcel. The estate has to sign, Greer agreed, which means we need the cousin to sign before Farrow formalizes an offer, because once money is on the table, her calculus changes. Has she responded to our letter? Damien asked. She telegraphed last week, Vivian said. He looked at her and she said, I was going to tell you. She said she hadn't made any commitments and wanted more information before proceeding. She asked about the farm's current situation. You didn't mention this, he said. The tone was even, but there was something underneath it. I found out yesterday afternoon. You were out with the fence crew and I didn't want to send someone to interrupt. She looked at him. I'm mentioning it now. He accepted this. What does she want to know? About Delacroix. Whether he's a good tenant. What the farm's value actually is, not just as land, but as a working property with a lease in place. She paused. I think she doesn't want to feel like she's making a decision that hurts someone, but she also doesn't know anyone out here and has only Farrow's version of the picture. Give her another version, Greer said simply. That's what we're doing, Vivian said. The letter they sent to the cousin, her name was Margaret Voss, a widow herself, living on her late husband's income in Philadelphia, was longer than the first one. Vivian wrote the majority of it. She described Delacroix in specific terms, how long he'd worked the land, what he'd built on it, how the farm had changed under his care. She described the 4 farms as a community that had survived the worst winter anyone could remember through the specific combination of preparation and mutual support. She did not mention Harlan Farrow by name. She mentioned, obliquely, that the property's most significant asset was not visible from any survey map, and that this asset had implications for neighbors that a buyer primarily interested in resale value might not weigh appropriately. Damien read the finished letter and was quiet for a moment. You didn't say what the asset was, he said. She'll ask, Vivian said. When she asks, she's invested. If I tell her, she can decide she already has enough information. He looked at the letter again. That's calculated. Yes, she said, without apology. These men play a long game, we play a longer one. He held her gaze. When did you learn to think like this? When I had no other resources, she said. When the only tools you have are information and attention, you learn to use them carefully. He nodded slowly, and she could see him filing this, adding it to whatever picture he was building of who she was. The accumulation of understanding between them had been going on for 5 months now, and it had the weight of that. She felt it. Margaret Voss's second telegram arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of March, when the temperature had climbed to what felt, after winter, like a remarkable warmth, though it was barely above freezing. Vivian was in the root cellar doing inventory when Clara came out to find her. She read the telegram standing in the cellar doorway with cold air on her back and pale spring light coming in from outside. Thank you for your letter, it read. What is the asset you refer to? Also, I should tell you that Mr. Farrow's firm has made a formal offer. I have not accepted, but I have not refused. I would like to speak with someone directly. She stood there for a moment. Clara was watching her with the look of someone hoping to be told what the telegram meant. Go tell Mr. Blackstone I need to speak with him when he has a moment, Vivian said. Tell him it's the Philadelphia matter. Clara went. Vivian stayed in the doorway, rereading the telegram. I have not accepted, but I have not refused. A woman who was trying to make the right decision and didn't have enough information to know what it was. A woman, probably, who had been handling things alone for long enough that the experience had made her cautious about offers that came from one direction only. Vivian understood this precisely. By the time Damien came to find her, she had already decided what she wanted to propose. She needs to talk to someone, she said. Not a letter, a person. The telephone at the county office, he said immediately. I can arrange access. It should be me, she said. He looked at her. The county office is 8 hours by wagon. I know. The road is still bad in places. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'll come with you. You don't need to. 8 hours by wagon, bad roads, and you're the only person who can have this conversation in a way that's going to work, he said. I'm not sending you alone. She looked at him for a moment. There were several things she might have said. All right, she said. We leave Thursday, he said. Quote, the road to the county seat in March was exactly what Damien had described. 8 hours of mud and thaw and occasional ice through country that was trying to become spring and not quite managing it yet. They left before dawn in the good wagon with 2 of the stronger horses and Reeves driving so that neither of them had to. Damien slept for the first 2 hours, which she found both endearing and faintly surprising. She'd assembled the impression of a man who didn't do anything so unguarded as sleep in the presence of other people. He slept sitting up, his head against the side of the wagon, with complete and utter absence of self-consciousness. She read and watched the country come up slowly out of the dark. When he woke, he was immediately alert, the way some people were, no interval of confusion. You could have slept too, he said. I don't sleep in wagons. Why not? I never learned to, she said. I used to envy people who could. He looked at the country going past. Helena slept anywhere, he said. Wagons, trains. She could sleep in a room full of people talking. I used to watch her do it and think it was the most remarkable skill I'd ever seen. It was the first time he'd mentioned Helena directly to her, not in the oblique way of things left out, but specifically by name as a present memory. She kept her voice even. What was she like? He was quiet for a moment. Warm, he said, the kind of person rooms liked. When she was in them, they were better. He paused. She wasn't much for practical things. She'd lose her household keys twice a week. She couldn't keep the cook staff working together for more than a month before something fell apart. A pause. But people loved her anyway, almost immediately when they met her. She sounds like someone worth loving, Vivian said carefully. She was. He said it simply, without performance. Then, you're not like her. No, she said. I meant it as an observation, he said, not a comparison. She looked at him. I know. He looked out at the road ahead. She would have liked you, I think, he said finally. She was a good judge of people. She would have seen what you were doing from the beginning and found it interesting. Vivian didn't say anything for a moment. The wagon moved through the warming morning, and the country around them was ugly and beautiful in equal measure, the way thawing things were. Thank you for telling me that, she said. He nodded once, and they rode the rest of the way in the comfortable silence that had, over 5 months, become its own language. The telephone call with Margaret Voss lasted 40 minutes. Vivian stood in the county office with the receiver held carefully against her ear and talked to a woman she'd never met about land and water and the specific gravity of a decision that would affect people Margaret Voss would also never meet. She described the spring plainly, what it fed, who depended on it, what would happen without it. She described Delacroix without sentimentality, but with precision. A man who had worked the same land for 11 years and improved every part of it that could be improved and asked for nothing except to be allowed to continue. Margaret Voss listened without interrupting, which told Vivian something about her. The questions she asked when Vivian finished were the questions of a practical woman. What was the land actually worth? What were the lease terms going forward? Was there an arrangement by which she could retain ownership while ensuring stability for the current tenant? There could be, Vivian said. We'd want your agreement to the Joint Water Registry first, that protects everyone, including you as a landowner, because it makes the spring's value explicit and registered, which increases the formal value of the property. A pause on the line. The offer from Pharaoh's firm, Margaret said. It was generous. I know, Vivian said. May I ask what they said the land was for? Investment purposes, Margaret said. Land consolidation, they called it. That's accurate, Vivian said. What they didn't tell you is that the consolidation involves redirecting the water from that spring away from 4 farms whose families have been working that land for 20 years. Another pause. Longer. They wouldn't have mentioned that, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. No, Vivian said. The silence on the line had a thinking quality. Vivian waited. I'd like to speak with Mr. Blackstone's attorney directly, Margaret finally said, about the registry and the lease arrangement. Can that be arranged? Yes, Vivian said. I'll have him contact you within the week. When she set down the receiver and turned around, Damien was standing in the doorway of the office. He'd given her the room, stayed in the hall for the full 40 minutes. Well, he said. She's not selling to Pharaoh, Vivian said. He exhaled slowly. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man who did dramatic exhales. Just a controlled, quiet release of something he'd been holding. You're certain, he said. She didn't say it in those words, Vivian said. But I've been listening to how people don't say things for long enough to know what it means. He looked at her for a moment. You're remarkable, he said. It came out of him too directly to have been calculated, and he seemed to know it immediately. He didn't take it back or deflect it into something smaller. He just stood there and let it sit in the air between them. This man who chose every word deliberately and had just let one get out ahead of the choice. Vivian felt something shift in the room, in herself, in the specific geometry of the space between them. We should start back, she said. We're losing light. We are, he said. They went out into the cooling March afternoon, and neither of them said anything more about it, and neither of them needed to. The ride back from the county seat took longer than the ride out, not because of the roads, which had actually improved slightly as the afternoon warmed. The mud softening to something more cooperative, the iced patches on the north-facing stretches reduced to narrow strips, rather than the full road crossings they'd navigated in the morning. It took longer because Reeves had pushed the horses hard coming out and was now managing them carefully on the return, reading their gait the way an experienced driver does, taking the grades slowly and resting them at the creek crossing for 10 minutes while the animals drank. Vivian sat on her side of the wagon and watched the country move past in the long amber light of a March afternoon that had decided briefly to be generous. The hills to the west caught the sun and held it. The creek they crossed ran high and fast with snowmelt, brown at the edges and clear in the middle. A hawk moved in slow circles above the far ridge, doing what hawks did in that particular unhurried way that suggested they had solved the problem of patience. Damien sat on the other side of the wagon and said nothing. He'd said almost nothing since they'd left the county office, which was not unusual for him in ordinary circumstances, but felt different now, textured differently. She was aware of him in the way you're aware of something that has shifted without moving. Same position, different weight. He'd said, "You're remarkable." 3 words, and she'd moved them both past it immediately because that had seemed like the right thing to do, the practical thing, the thing that kept the afternoon from becoming something they'd have to navigate carefully for weeks afterward. She was good at practical things. She'd been good at them her whole adult life. She watched the hawk drop suddenly, fold, and vanish below the ridgeline. Reeves, to his credit, drove the entire 8 hours without once looking back at them. Spring arrived properly in the last week of March, the way it did in the valley. Not gently, not as a slow transition, but as a definitive shift that happened between one morning and the next. You went to sleep under winter and woke to something fundamentally different. Mud that smelled of earth instead of cold, birds in the cottonwoods before dawn, light that had recovered its angle and was doing what light did when it had room to do it. The ranch transformed with the season. The cattle moved back to open pasture, strung out across the south fields in long, slow lines. The fence crews went out to assess and repair what winter had damaged. The horse training that had been limited to the covered arena all winter moved back outside, and the sound of it, hooves on soft ground, the occasional short whistle from the trainers, became part of the daily texture of the place again. Vivian watched this transformation from the vantage point of 5 months of accumulated understanding. She knew the ranch now in the way you know a place you've decided deserves that effort. She knew which fence line would need the most work. She knew which of the cattle hands was best with the difficult horses, and which of them was skilled at the cattle work, but had a temper problem around the animals that Reeves had been quietly managing for 2 years. She knew the rhythm of the week and where it was inefficient and where it was working and why. She also knew by this point that she'd stayed past the date when it had simply been about finding stable ground. That knowledge sat with her through the early weeks of spring like a stone she kept turning over. Not a burden exactly, but not something she could set down and forget either. She'd been careful. She'd been more careful than she generally was, because the stakes of being careless here were more specific than usual. And then Thomas Greer arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, which should have been straightforward because the joint water registry had been filed and the Sutton lease arrangement finalized, and the Farrow matter was, for practical purposes, concluded. But Thomas Greer had not ridden 4 hours from the county seat to report on something she already knew. He came with a letter. She was in the kitchen going over the spring household accounts when Clara came in with the look of someone carrying significant news and not sure how significant it actually was. "There's a lawyer in the sitting room," she said. "He asked for you specifically, not Mr. Blackstone. You." Vivian set down her pen. Greer was standing at the window of the sitting room when she came in, looking out at the paddock with his hat in his hands. He turned when she entered and gave her the particular look of a man who has information that isn't straightforwardly good or bad, and is deciding how to present it. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I apologize for coming without advance word. I thought this merited a personal visit rather than a letter or telegram." "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. He placed his hat on his knee and reached into his coat. "Are you familiar with a man named Charles Whitmore?" he said. She went still. "My previous employer." "The son," he said. "Charles Whitmore, Jr. He died in February." She absorbed this. She'd known about the elder Whitmore, who'd died 3 years ago. The son had been in his 40s, a drinker, someone she'd seen rarely during her years at the house. He'd contested his mother's estate after her death, which was what had ultimately caused the household to dissolve and her position to end. "I'm sorry to hear it," she said, because it was the appropriate thing, and because she did not know yet what this had to do with her. Greer opened the document. "Charles Whitmore, Jr. had no children. His will names several beneficiaries. You're among them." The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear 2 of the ranch hands arguing amiably about something near the barn. "That's not possible," she said. "I was an employee. I hadn't had contact with the family in 14 months. Mrs. Helena Whitmore, the elder, apparently left instructions with her personal attorney that were separate from the estate documents. After her son's death, which was the contingency that triggered them, those instructions were to be executed." He looked down at the document. "She left you the Albany property on Chambers Street, Upton. That's a house with 3 rental units currently occupied, and a lump sum of $4,000. Vivian sat with this. $4,000. A house with rental income. She tried to arrange her thinking around these facts and found that her thinking was not cooperating. "There must be a mistake," she said. "There's no mistake," Greer said, not unkindly. "I verified the documents personally. Mrs. Whitmore appears to have thought highly of you. Her personal notes, which I've seen excerpts of, indicate that she felt you were the most reliable person in her employ and that she wanted to ensure your security." "Bar such saying." He paused. "You don't have to decide anything immediately. The Albany property is being managed by an agent, the tenants are current on rent, and the money will be held in trust until you arrange collection. But I'd encourage you to think about what you want to do." She looked at the document he placed on the table in front of her. Her name, in clear legal type. The address of a house she'd never seen except in passing. A number she would have considered a kind of fantasy 6 months ago. "Thank you for coming personally," she said. He stood, replaced his hat. "There's one other thing," he said. He seemed to be measuring his words. "Harlan Farrow was in my office last week. He's aware of this inheritance. I don't know how... The filing is a matter of public record, but it's a record in Albany, not here. Someone told him." He met her eyes. "He asked about your current situation." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. It's not my information to share." He picked up his hat. "But I thought you should know that he's interested in it." He paused at the door. "Congratulations, Miss Ashcroft, and be careful." He left. She sat in the sitting room alone for several minutes. $4,000. A house in Albany. The life she could have built if things had gone differently. The life she could build now, if she chose. She heard Damien come in through the back of the house, the particular sound of his boots on the stone floor, the familiar sequence of coat on hook, hat on the high shelf. She did not move from where she was sitting. He found her because he always moved through the house with an awareness of where people were in it, and the sitting room was not where she usually was at this hour. He stopped in the doorway. "Greer was here," he said. "Yes." He read her face. Something happened. "Sit down," she said. She told him. He listened the way he listened, fully, without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the document on the table between them. "That's a considerable inheritance," he said finally. "Yes. For someone in your position, what you had 6 months ago, it changes things significantly." "Yes," she said, "it does." He was quiet again. She watched him work through whatever he was working through, and she didn't try to read it too precisely because she wasn't sure she wanted to know all of it before he was ready to say it. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. He nodded. "Take the time you need." "Damien," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name without a context to carry it, just the name addressed directly. He looked at her. "You should know," she said carefully, "that this doesn't feel the way I expected it to feel. Getting news like this." He waited. "I expected relief," she said. "I've been working since I was 18. Every position I've held, some part of me was aware that if it ended badly, the next option was worse. That's a specific kind of weight." She paused. "This should remove that weight, and it does. But underneath it, there's something else." "What?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to leave," she said. "That's the thing I didn't expect. That I would sit here with enough money to build a comfortable life somewhere else and find that the first thing I feel is that I don't want to go." The room was very still. He didn't move, didn't change expression in any large way. But something happened in his eyes, the quality of them, the things she'd been not looking at directly for months, that told her the words had landed where she'd meant them to. "Then don't," he said. "It's not as simple as that." "Tell me why not," he said. Not a challenge, genuinely asking. She pressed her hands together on her lap. "Because you've been very careful," she said. "And I've been very careful. And I'm not going to pretend I don't know why we've both been careful." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, neither am I." "I'm an employee," she said. "At the moment," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not explaining myself well," he said. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I've been thinking about this for a while. Before the county seat, before the letter from Philadelphia, before any of this." He gestured at the document without looking at it. "I want to say it clearly so you understand what I mean and what I don't mean." "All right," she said. "The position," he said. "Housekeeper. I want to change that." "To what?" He looked at her directly. "I want you beside me, as a partner, someone who has standing in this ranch and this community because of what you've built here, not because of a job title that doesn't come close to describing what you actually do." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, Vivian, not because it's the next logical step, because I want my life to have you in it in a way that—" He stopped. "In a way that lasts." She sat with this. Outside, the afternoon was doing what April afternoons did. Sun and cloud in alternation, the light changing every few minutes, the ranch moving through its ordinary work with complete indifference to what was happening in the sitting room of the main house. "You once told me you didn't want anyone trying to fix things that weren't broken," she said. Something shifted in his face. "I know what I said." "And the things that were broken?" "Within reason," he said, which was exactly what he'd said that first night, and she could tell from the careful way he said it that he remembered too. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been in the world for 42 years and had built something extraordinary and had also managed to become, somewhere in the middle of it, genuinely lonely in a way that he hadn't fully admitted to himself until someone arrived and started leaving the fires burning. "Ask me again in a month," she said. He blinked. "Not because I'm uncertain about you," she said quickly, Because I want to understand what I'm choosing. The inheritance changes my position. I want to make sure that when I give you an answer, you know it came from a person who had a choice, not a person who was deciding between options. He absorbed this. You want to make sure you're not staying because you have nowhere else to go. I want to make sure you know I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, all right. And she could hear in it that he understood, and that understanding it was not easy for him, and that he was going to do it anyway. A month, he said. A month, she said. The month that followed was one of the stranger periods of her life. On its surface, nothing changed. She continued managing the household. The spring work consumed the ranch. Damien was out long hours in the new warmth, which was genuinely necessary. The winter had left damage to assess and repair across thousands of acres of fencing. The cattle needed moving. The hayfields needed attention. They ate dinner together when he was back early enough. They talked about the ranch, the community, the practical concerns of a frontier enterprise coming out of a difficult winter. But the conversation in the sitting room was present, not as an awkwardness, but as a kind of shared knowledge they were both carrying. She noticed it in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of something and looked at her. Not longingly, not pressingly, but with the specific attention of a man trying to memorize something he wasn't sure yet he was allowed to keep. She noticed it in herself too, the way she'd begun to think in terms of permanence without meaning to. Not this winter, but next winter. Not while I'm here, but simply what needs to happen. She wrote to the Albany property agent. She asked for a full accounting of the rental income and the property's current state. The response came back thorough and professional. 3 tenants, all long-term, the property in good condition, generating steady income. The agent asked what she wanted to do. She told him to continue managing it until she instructed otherwise. She wrote to Margaret Voss, separately from anything to do with the land matter, simply because the telephone conversation had left her with the sense of a person she'd like to know. The letter she received back was unexpectedly personal. Margaret Voss, it turned out, was 70 years old and had been a schoolteacher for 20 of them, and had opinions about most things, and shared them freely in writing. She mentioned, in passing, that Delacroix had sent her flowers from his garden, which had startled her. She'd written back to thank him. Vivian read this and smiled to herself, in the kitchen, alone. She went to see May Norris on a Wednesday in mid-April. Not for any reason connected to the Faro matter, which was concluded, just to visit. May was in her garden, not the kitchen garden, which was practical, but a small plot to the side of the house where she was putting in something that looked like it might eventually be flowers, though the ground was still stubborn. Thought you'd be too busy with spring work to ride out this way, May said, without stopping what she was doing. I had time, Vivian said. How are the boys? Franklin skinned his knee falling off the fence for the 3rd time this season. Joseph is teaching the cat arithmetic. May sat back on her heels and looked at Vivian with those direct eyes. You look like you're thinking about something. I'm always thinking about something. Something different then. May pulled off her gloves and stood, pressing one hand briefly to the small of her back. Come inside. I've got coffee. They sat at May's kitchen table in the particular comfortable way of women who'd gotten past the social surface with each other. The coffee was May's coffee, which could strip paint, and Vivian drank it without comment, as she always did. I heard a rumor, May said. What kind? The kind that involves you and a very large ranch and a man who hasn't looked entirely like himself for about 6 months. May wrapped her hands around her cup. Town is watching, you know. Can't help it. Nothing else interesting is happening. What's the town saying? Depends on who you ask. Most people, the sensible ones, are hoping you stay. Ruth Caldwell told me she'd consider it a personal loss if you left. May paused. Mrs. Halloran says it's all very predictable and she has opinions about it, but nobody was particularly listening to her. Vivian looked at her coffee. You got some money, May said. Not accusing, just direct. News travels. Greer's paralegal lives here. Her sister has a big mouth. May shrugged. It's a small town. Are you going to stay? Vivian looked up. I'm thinking about it. What's there to think about? May said, not unkindly. You're happy here. Anyone with eyes can see it. I know what it looks like when someone's found their place because I found mine and I was stubborn enough to keep it. She paused. You're allowed to have money and still want the thing you already have. I know that. Do you? Vivian was quiet for a moment. I want to choose it knowing it's a choice, she said, not a circumstance. May considered this. Then, my husband proposed to me on a Thursday, and I told him to ask me again on Saturday. She smiled, well, briefly, privately. He thought I was ridiculous. He asked me again on Saturday. I said yes. He never entirely understood why I needed the 2 days. She paused. But I needed them because I wanted to say yes because I meant it, not because he was standing there asking. Vivian looked at her. He came back on Saturday, she said. That tells you something too. Bullshit, gay? Oh. She came back from May's farm in the early evening, when the light was going gold over the western hills and the ranch was beginning its end-of-day movements. Cattle settling, horses watered, the crew drifting toward the bunkhouse. She put up her horse herself, because it was faster and because she liked the work, and she was coming through the barn when she nearly walked into Harlan Farrow. He was not alone. He had Cleet with him, and a third man she didn't recognize. Well-dressed, carrying a leather satchel, the look of a professional who'd been brought to handle something specific. They were standing in the yard between the barn and the main house, and Reeves was with them, which told her they'd arrived recently and hadn't yet been inside. Farrow looked at her with the expression she remembered from his brief appearance in the sitting room in February. The polished surface and the calculation behind it. Miss Ashcroft, he said pleasantly. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Blackstone. He's not back from the South Fields yet, she said. She looked at the three of them. What can I do for you? Perhaps we should wait inside, Farrow said. What's the nature of the visit? She said. She said it politely, which she found required only moderate effort. Business, Farrow said. A proposition for the ranch. I think Mr. Blackstone will want to hear it. He generally meets with people by appointment, she said. I understand. We happen to be passing through. He smiled. It was an excellent smile, so the kind that had probably worked very well on a great many people for a great many years. We won't take much of his time. She showed them to the sitting room. She brought them coffee, which they accepted. She did not leave the house. She was in the hallway, within earshot, when Damien came in 20 minutes later. She heard him come down the hall, heard him stop at the sitting room door, heard the brief exchange of introductions. She heard Reeves say quietly, She's here, and she heard Damien's footsteps pause. Then, Miss Ashcroft, could you join us? She came in. Farrow looked at her and then at Damien and recalibrated something behind his eyes. We've met, Vivian said simply. Damien took the chair to her left. He didn't look at her, but she felt the deliberateness of where he'd chosen to sit. Farrow placed his hands on his knees and delivered what was clearly a prepared presentation. He had, he said, an offer for a parcel of Blackstone Ranch's eastern land. Not a large parcel, he was quick to clarify. 40 acres near the southern boundary. He had a client, a developer from back east, interested in establishing a supply depot for the frontier trade routes. It was, Farrow said, an excellent location for such a facility, with access to the main road and proximity to the valley's growing commercial traffic. He named a price that was fair. Not insulting, not extravagant. Fair. The third man, introduced as a surveyor, opened his satchel and produced a map. Vivian looked at it. The parcel in question was 40 acres of unremarkable scrubland on the southeastern edge of the ranch. It was not the spring parcel. It was not farmland. On its face, it was exactly what Farrow described, a logical location for a supply depot. She looked at the map more carefully. The access road that the map showed for the proposed depot crossed a strip of land that wasn't marked as part of the purchase. A utility easement, written in small print at the corner. Permanent right of access, granted as part of the sale. She looked at where the utility easement ran. It ran directly past the eastern corner of the Norris Farm's southern boundary, which put it within 200 yards of the spring. She set the map down carefully. Damien was asking Farrow questions about the developer. Name, previous projects, timeline. Farrow answered smoothly. Cleet was watching Vivian with the same careful attention she'd noticed back in February. She met his eyes briefly and then looked back at the map. The easement, she said when there was a pause. Farrow looked at her. Standard commercial access easement, he said, required for the depot's supply routes. It runs along the Norris Farm's southern boundary, she said. It runs along the ranch's own land, Pharaoh said. The easement is entirely within the property being purchased. It terminates 40 feet from the registered water access point for the joint spring, she said. The room was quiet. Cleet Pharaoh's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight adjustment, almost imperceptible, the way a man shifts when he realizes the ground is different than he thought it was. Harlan Pharaoh's smile stayed in place. I'm not sure what concern a water access point would be for a commercial supply depot. I'm not sure either, Vivian said pleasantly. Can you tell us what the easement is needed for specifically? The route to the main road doesn't require access in that direction. Pharaoh looked at her steadily. Supply logistics. Which logistics? A pause. Brief, but present. Damien picked up the map, looked at it, set it back down. He said nothing. He looked at Pharaoh with the level, unhurried gaze of a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. Mr. Pharaoh, he said, I appreciate the offer. I'll think about it. Of course, Pharaoh said. Take all the time you need. I generally do, Damien said. He showed them out himself. Vivian stayed in the sitting room. When Damien came back, he closed the door behind him, which he rarely did, and sat down across from her. He looked at the map that Pharaoh had, for some reason, left behind. The easement, he said. Once it's established, she said, it can be used to contest the water registry on the grounds of pre-existing access rights. It's thin, but it gives them standing. It gives them something to argue. She paused. It would have taken us another 6 months to notice it in the fine print, by which time it would have been filed. He looked at her. You read that in about 4 minutes. I was looking for it, she said. After the spring parcel didn't work and the Sutton estate didn't work, there had to be a third approach. I just didn't know what shape it would take. You've been waiting for a third approach. I've been expecting one, she said. Men like Pharaoh don't give up because 1 or 2 avenues close. They're patient. They just find the next path. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm not selling the parcel, he said. No. And the easement route. He can't get access to that strip of land through anyone else. It's entirely within ranch boundaries. As far as I can read the map, she said, you'd want Greer to confirm it. I'll wire him tomorrow. He looked at the map one more time and then set it aside. Vivian. She looked at him. The month, he said. It's been 3 weeks. She held his gaze. I'm not pressing, he said. I said a month. I meant a month. I know, she said. I just want you to know, he said carefully, that the inheritance doesn't change anything I said. Either direction. If you decide to go, I understand it. And if you stay, I want you to know I'm not asking you to stay as a housekeeper who's agreed to also be my wife. I'm asking you to stay as someone who has equal standing in every decision about this place. He paused. That's not how most arrangements work out here. I know it isn't, she said. But it's the one I'm proposing, he said, because it's the only one I think would be honest. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had spent 7 years behind walls of his own construction, careful and controlled and quietly diminishing, who had led her into his kitchen and his office and his thinking and, incrementally, into the parts of himself he'd stopped showing to anyone, who sat across from her now and offered her partnership the way he did everything that mattered to him, directly, without ornamentation, without asking for anything in return except honesty. Outside, the spring evening was settling in over the ranch. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, someone had started playing a harmonica badly, the kind of playing that was committed to, if not yet skilled. The horses were quiet. The smell of Horace's dinner was coming through the house. She thought about May Norris's kitchen. She thought about the hawk she'd watched fold and drop above the ridge. She thought about a month ago and a letter from Albany and the specific quality of the feeling she'd had sitting in the sitting room alone. Not the relief she'd expected, but something else. The knowledge of what she didn't want to lose. I'm not going to Albany, she said. He was very still. The property can generate income where it is, she said. It doesn't need me there to do that. She looked at him steadily. I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. You know that. I know that, he said. And I'm not staying because the position is comfortable, she said. There are more comfortable positions in better located places. I know that too, he said. I'm staying, she said, because this is where I want to be. And because what you're proposing, she paused, is the first time anyone has described a future to me in terms of what I'd have rather than what I'd give. He was quiet for a moment that had considerable weight in it. Is that a yes? He said. That's a yes, she said. He exhaled, the same controlled, quiet release she'd seen in the county office, but different now. He leaned forward and took her hand, which was not how she'd imagined this moment, but was somehow exactly right. Not dramatic, not performed, just the specific warmth of a large weathered hand covering hers on the arm of a chair in a sitting room where the fire had burned down to coals and someone in the bunkhouse was still working on the harmonica. I'll talk to Thomas Greer, he said, about the legal arrangements, the property transfer, the partnership documents. She almost laughed. Now? Not now, he said with the dry undertone. Tomorrow. Much better, she said. He didn't let go of her hand immediately. They sat in the fading light, and the harmonica in the bunkhouse stumbled through something that was almost recognizable as a song, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything else that needed saying yet. The thing she had noticed, which she had not said and would not say for a long time, was that she had come to this ranch with a suitcase and a few coins and a list of practical reasons, and somewhere in the months between October and April, without any particular plan, she had built the most substantial thing she had ever owned. Not the Albany property, not the inheritance. This, all of this, the people in it, the work of it, the difficult breathing life of a place that had learned to be a home again. That was hers. She had made it so, and she was going to keep it. They were married on a Saturday in early May, when the valley had finally committed to being warm. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted a large wedding, which was one of the many things they had discovered they agreed on without needing to discuss it at length. Damien had suggested the county magistrate and a small gathering, and Vivian had said that sounded right, and that had been the entirety of the planning conversation. What actually happened was somewhat larger than either of them intended, because word got out, as word always got out in Redstone Valley, through the specific telegraph system of people who mentioned things to other people who mentioned things to their spouses, and by the morning of the wedding, the front yard of Blackstone Ranch had acquired a considerable number of people who had decided their presence was appropriate regardless of formal invitation. May Norris came with Franklin and Joseph, the latter of whom had put on a collar that was visibly strangling him. Gunnar Halverson arrived in his wagon, which he'd cleaned for the occasion, wearing a coat she'd never seen before and holding his hat in both hands with the careful reverence of a man attending something he understood to be important. The Briggs came, Oliver and Dora and their daughter, who had been briefed on the concept of being quiet for a ceremony and was managing it with intense effort. Delacroix made the trip from the Sutton property. Edgar and Ruth Caldwell arrived together, Ruth in a dress that looked like it had been pressed specifically for this, which from Ruth was significant. Even old Hewitt came, carried to the wagon by two of his neighbors and installed in a chair in the front row, with the dignity of a man who had decided to attend and was not going to let his bad knees be an argument against it. Mrs. Halloran was not there. Vivian noticed this without particular feeling. Some things simply were what they were. The magistrate, a man named Porter, who had been performing these ceremonies for 15 years and had developed the practiced warmth of someone who'd done a thing enough times to know how to do it well, stood on the front porch of the ranch house and spoke plainly about commitment and partnership, without flourish. Vivian stood beside Damien in her best dress, which was not a wedding dress, but was a deep blue wool that she'd had let out at the seams and pressed until it held its shape properly, and she held his hand and listened to the words and thought, "This is real." Not dreamily, just factually, the way you sometimes notice the reality of things when they've been abstract for a long time and then suddenly aren't. Damien said the words when he was meant to say them, in his even, direct voice, looking at her the way he looked at things he was fully committed to understanding. She said hers. Hewitt started clapping before Porter had quite finished, and then everyone was clapping, and Joseph Norris let out a whoop that his mother silenced with a look, and somewhere in the back Horace was pretending to have something in his eye. Later, she would not remember the ceremony as the significant moment. The significant moment came afterward, when most of the guests had moved to the yard where Horace had set up tables, and the afternoon was warm and full of the sounds of people eating together. She was standing near the edge of the gathering, just for a moment, just to breathe. And Damien came and stood beside her, not touching, just beside. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You?" He looked out at the yard full of people. His ranch hands, his foremen, the families from town, Reeves with his hat pushed back, laughing at something Castro was saying, Clara and Beth moving plates with the confidence of girls who'd grown into their work. "Yes," he said, and she believed him completely. The Faro matter resolved itself in June, which was anticlimactic in the way that good legal work was anticlimactic, not with a confrontation or a dramatic reversal, but with a filing. Thomas Greer sent a letter to Harlan Faro's firm informing them that Blackstone Ranch was not considering the sale of any eastern parcels, that the proposed easement route crossed land that was subject to an existing water access registry involving 4 neighboring properties, and that any further approaches regarding land adjacent to the registered spring would be met with a formal complaint to the county registry board. Faro's firm sent a reply that was professionally courteous and said nothing in particular, and that was the end of it. Not a triumph, not a defeat, just the closing of a door that had been left open too long and the quiet of things properly settled. Vivian read Greer's letter at the kitchen table and then put it in the file she kept for correspondence of this kind. She didn't feel the need to make anything of it. She'd learned that this was how most important things ended. Not with the moment you'd imagined, but with paperwork and a filing date and the understanding that you didn't have to think about it anymore. She told Damien over dinner. "Good," he said. "That's all?" "What else?" he said, which was fair. She passed him the bread. He took it. Outside, the June evening was long and warm, and the ranch was in the particular ease that came in the good months when the work was steady rather than desperate and the days had enough light to feel generous. "I want to do something," she said. He looked at her. "The emergency supply problem," she said, "the one I've been writing notes about since February. There are 3 settlements within a day's ride of Redstone Valley that have no organized supply reserve. If another winter like last year comes, what are you thinking?" he said. "A depot," she said. "Not large. Staffed by someone local in each settlement. We fund the initial stock, the settlements maintain it. Clear terms. Not charity. A community investment arrangement." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through the way he thought through practical things. Not quickly, not in performance of consideration, but actually working it. 3 depots, he said. Starting stock for each, you're looking at... "I've done the numbers," she said. She slid the notebook across the table. He read it, turned a page, read further. "The staffing," he said. "Someone local who has standing in the community, knows who needs what." "Someone like May Norris," she said. "For the eastern settlements, she knows those families. She's trusted. You'd pay her for it. Paid work. Clear terms. Not a favor." He nodded slowly. "The Halverson boy," he said. "The older one, Marcus. He's been looking for something beyond the farm. He's organized, handles himself well." "I didn't know about him," she said. "I'll introduce you," he said, and passed the notebook back. It was, she thought, one of their better dinners. "Opa, my son?" May said yes on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in her kitchen with the coffee that could strip paint, which Vivian had by now genuinely developed a tolerance for. "It's paid work," Vivian said. "Real wages. 4 hours a week in ordinary times, more if something comes up. The depot would be on the north side of your property. There's a building there that would work with some repair. We'd fund the repair." May looked at her for a long moment. "You know I was going to say yes before you got to the wages," May said. "I know, but the wages matter. I wasn't going to leave them out." May wrapped her hands around her cup. Franklin appeared briefly in the doorway, assessed that no interesting food was involved in the adult conversation, and disappeared again. "Joseph has decided the cat is teaching him arithmetic now," May said without preamble, "instead of the other way around." "How's the cat doing?" "Terrible at fractions." May looked at her. "You know what's different about you than when you got here? Tell me." "You're not managing everything at a distance anymore," May said. "When you came, you were very good at figuring out what people needed and making sure it happened. But you did it from about 3 feet back, like you weren't sure whether you were allowed to be part of it." She paused. "Now you're in it. You're actually in it. Vivian looked at her coffee. I think I was waiting to see if it would last, she said, before I let it be real. And now? She thought about the wedding and the papers Greer had filed and the depot plan in the notebook and Damien reading the numbers at the kitchen table with his reading glasses that he'd only recently admitted he needed and which he wore with the reluctant dignity of a man accepting something he can't argue with. Now I know it's going to last, she said, because I'm the one making sure it does. May smiled, fully, the rare version. That's the right answer, she said. The depots were established over the summer. It was not a smooth process. Nothing practical ever was. The first depot, on the Norris property, came together reasonably well. The building was sound enough to work with. May proved to have a natural aptitude for the logistics of inventory management, and the eastern settlements received the news of the arrangement with a combination of relief and the specific pride of frontier communities that wanted to know they were not dependent on anyone's charity. The arrangement Vivian had designed was careful about this. The settlements contributed labor for the initial setup and a small annual fee that was nominal but present because people protect what they've invested in and discount what they've been given. The second depot, further north in a settlement called Garnet Fork, ran into problems of a different kind. The local man they'd identified as a potential manager, a reasonable choice on paper, turned out to have a complicated relationship with 3 of the settlement's 4 leading families that nobody had mentioned and that revealed itself only after he'd been in the role for 6 weeks. There were 2 arguments, a formal complaint submitted to nobody in particular, and a period of approximately 2 months where the depot sat fully stocked and completely unused because the community couldn't agree on who had the standing to access it. Vivian went to Garnet Fork herself in September, leaving before dawn and arriving by mid-morning with Edgar driving and her second notebook in her pocket. She spent the day talking to people. Not together, separately, in the specific way she'd learned was more productive when a community had calcified around a dispute. She did not attempt to solve the problem. She asked questions, listened to the answers, and by late afternoon she had a clear enough picture to understand that the real issue was not the manager or the families but a water access dispute from 4 years ago that had never been resolved and had contaminated every subsequent interaction. She could not fix the water dispute in an afternoon. She said so honestly. What I can do, she told the assembled families that evening, in the back room of the settlement's general store, is make sure the depot works regardless, because if a bad winter comes, none of you will be talking about the water dispute. You'll be talking about who has flour. A man named Decker, who was the oldest person in the room, and had the standing that came from age and from having been present for everything that had happened in Garnet Fork for 40 years, looked at her from the back wall. You're saying put the argument on a shelf, he said. I'm saying the argument will still be there in spring, she said. But if you use the depot this winter, you'll have spent months proving you can cooperate on something that's usually worth more than the original argument. Decker was quiet for a long moment. The room was quiet with him. Replace Hendricks as manager, he said finally. Put my granddaughter in the role. She doesn't have a side in this. Does she want the job? Vivian asked. He looked slightly surprised, as though the question hadn't occurred to him. I'll ask her, he said. The granddaughter, whose name was Lana, 18 years old, with the precise handwriting of someone who'd taken her schooling seriously, said yes the next morning and turned out to be better at the role than anyone, including Vivian, had anticipated. The third depot, in a settlement even further from the valley, came together almost without incident, which Vivian regarded with mild suspicion. It went well, Damien said when she reported this. Too well, she said. You're looking for problems, he said. I'm looking for the problems that are there regardless of whether I look for them, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know well, the one that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. You're going to check on it in January. February, she said. January is too expected. He shook his head slightly and went back to the account ledger. She watched him for a moment. This man, in this house, at this table, reading numbers in the lamplight, with the reading glasses he wore without comment, and the particular focused quiet of someone who had found, finally, the right pace for his own life. She had been thinking about something for several weeks and had not yet said it, because it was the kind of thing that required the right moment, and she'd been waiting for one. I want to talk about the school, she said. He looked up. Redstone Valley doesn't have one, she said. The children are educated at home mostly, or not at all. There are 14 children of school age between this ranch and the eastern farms alone, 23 in the full valley. She paused. I've been making notes. He looked at her for a long moment. Of course you have, Ma, he said. The county will fund a teacher's salary if the community provides the building, she said. We could provide the building. There's a parcel on the north edge of town that's been sitting empty for 3 years. I looked into the title and it's free and clear. When did you look into the title? June, she said. He set down the pen. You've been sitting on this since June. I was waiting until the depots were running, she said, one thing at a time. He looked at the ceiling briefly, the look he sometimes got when he was deciding whether to be amused or exasperated, and she'd learned that when it went that long, it was usually going to land on amused. How much? He said. She slid the notebook across the table. He read, turned pages, read more. He was quiet for several minutes. The building's the easy part, he said. The hard part is finding a teacher willing to come out here. I wrote to a school in Ohio that trains frontier teachers, she said. They have 3 candidates who expressed interest in a Western placement. He looked at her. The letters are in the file, she said. I can get them. I believe you, he said, which was the voice he used when he was fully committed and not going to argue. Write back. Tell them we have a building coming. I wanted to make sure you agreed first. Vivian, he said, when have I disagreed with anything in that notebook? She thought about it. The cost on the Garnet Fork roof repair, she said. You said I'd overestimated. I was wrong, he said. The contractor came in exactly at your number. I know, she said. He picked up the pen again. Write to Ohio, he said. Meg. The school opened this following spring, in a building that the Redstone Valley community had mostly built themselves. Damien's money and Vivian's organizing, but the hands and the time had come from the people who lived there, which was how it needed to be. The teacher was a young woman of 23 named Miss Aldridge, from Columbus, who arrived with 2 trunks of books and a calm, practical demeanor that suggested she'd been correctly briefed on what frontier teaching involved. She was not frightened by Redstone Valley, which Vivian took as a good sign. On the first day of school, 21 children showed up. Joseph Norris sat in the second row and explained to Miss Aldridge within the first 10 minutes that he'd been teaching a cat arithmetic. Miss Aldridge thanked him for this information and moved on. Vivian stood at the back of the room for the first hour, not to supervise, just to see. To be present for the thing that had been a notebook entry in June and was now 21 children with slates, at desks that Oliver Briggs had built, in a building that smelled of fresh wood and chalk and something that might, with time, become the specific smell of education. She stayed for the hour and then went back to the ranch, because there was work waiting, and because the thing she'd come to see was already doing fine without her. That was the measure. That was always the measure, not whether you were needed in the room, but whether you'd built something that worked when you left it. By the time the valley's second winter came around, the one after the bad blizzard, the shape of things had changed enough that even the people most resistant to change had quietly stopped resisting. The depots were stocked. May Norris ran the eastern one with a precision that had begun to be discussed in admiring terms in settlements she'd never visited. Lena Decker in Garnet Fork had taken it on herself to add a monthly accounting that she sent to Vivian. Unsolicited, meticulously organized, a document that Vivian found more useful than anything she'd asked for. The school ran through the cold months without interruption, Miss Aldridge proving to be one of those people who were simply not inconvenienced by difficulty. She requested, in November, a second room. Vivian wrote back that she'd look into it. Damien had begun something he'd been reluctant about initially and had gradually come around to, an apprenticeship program on the ranch, taking on young men from smaller farms who wanted to learn a trade, smithing, carpentry, animal husbandry, and training them for a season before they returned to their own properties with skills they wouldn't otherwise have had access to. It had been Vivian's idea. She'd proposed it twice before he'd said yes, and the second time he'd said yes, she'd been specific enough about the terms that he couldn't find a practical objection. You waited me out, he said, when the first apprentices arrived. I improved the proposal, she said. You improved it the second time, knowing I'd run out of objections. That's also improving it, she said. He gave her the look. She gave it back. They'd gotten quite fluent in this. The Farrow brothers left the county in August, not because of anything Vivian or Damien had done directly. Harlan Farrow had. It emerged through the specific and inevitable way that information moved in frontier country, overextended himself on 3 separate land deals that had each depended on the others and had each, separately, encountered problems. Without the Redstone Valley acquisitions, the Spring parcel, the Sutton estate, the ranch easement, the structure he'd been building had no anchor point, and things began to slide. Greer sent a note informing Vivian that Farrow's firm had closed its county office. He wrote it in the dry, uninflected tone of a lawyer reporting facts. She read it at the kitchen table, put it in the file, and did not think about it much afterward. This was the thing she'd learned across a year and a half of doing this work. The problems that felt enormous while you were solving them shrank in retrospect to exactly their actual size, which was usually smaller than they'd felt. The blizzard was real. The Farrow threat was real. The struggling families, the contested water, the Garnet Fork dispute, all real, all requiring actual effort to resolve. But they had not defined anything. They had only been the conditions. The work itself, the living of it, the daily particular effort of building something in a difficult place with imperfect people using incomplete information, that was the thing. That was what remained when the problems resolved. She thought about this on an October evening, almost exactly a year after she'd arrived at Redstone Valley on a train that had grudgingly surrendered to it. She was sitting on the front porch of the ranch house in the last of the evening light, which was doing what October light did in the valley, going gold and long across the land, catching the yellow of the cottonwoods along the creek beds, making the whole plain look briefly like something out of a story you'd want to live in. The air was cold enough to require a coat, and she'd brought one. In the distance, the cattle were moving to their evening positions in the south pasture, and she could hear 2 of the ranch hands calling to each other across the distance, their voices carrying thin and clear in the dry air. Damien came out and sat beside her. He had coffee. He'd brought her tea without being asked, which he'd started doing sometime in the summer without announcing it. He handed her the cup and sat down and looked at the same view she was looking at. They were quiet for a while. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What?" "Helena," he said. She waited. "I used to think that working the way I worked, putting everything into the ranch, into the business, that it was for her, after she died, that it was how I honored her." He paused. "I've been thinking that wasn't quite right." "What was it?" "Avoidance," he said simply. "Good avoidance. Productive avoidance. But still." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "She would have hated what this house was when you got here." "You kept it clean," Vivian said. "I kept it maintained," he said. "Different thing. You've said that. Once." I remembered. He looked out at the land. She would have liked what it is now. She thought about what he'd said on the wagon to the county seat. She was warm, the kind of person rooms liked. She thought about the specific kind of loss that was losing someone like that, someone who made rooms better, and what you did with yourself in the years after, when all the rooms were quieter. "You didn't stop honoring her when you started living again," Vivian said. "I want to make sure you know that." He looked at her. "I know that," he said. "I do now." He paused. "You gave me that." "You were going to find your way back eventually," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But it would have taken longer." A pause. "I might have gotten there just in time to be old." She felt the laugh before it came, which was still somewhat surprising to her. She was not, by nature, a person who laughed easily, and she'd been around him for a year and a half and was still occasionally surprised by the moments he produced this. "You're not old," she said. "I'm older than you," he said. "That's not the same thing." He almost smiled, the full version. It still changed his face considerably. They sat in the cooling evening while the light finished its daily work on the valley and the ranch moved through its end-of-day rhythms around them. Somewhere in the house, Horace was preparing dinner. Clara had left for a position closer to town 3 months ago. It had been the right move for her, and Vivian had said so. And her replacement, a young woman named Agatha, was still learning the shape of the household but was learning it well. Nothing was finished. That was the truth of it, and Vivian had come to find it more sustaining than the idea of finished things. The school needed its second room. The third depot needed its February check. The apprenticeship program was in its first season and would need adjustment before it was right. Damien had an ongoing dispute with the county over a road grading project that was going to require attention in the spring. Margaret Voss had written asking whether she might visit Redstone Valley sometime, which Vivian thought was a possibility that deserved encouragement. There was always more. There was always the next thing. She had spent a long time in her life believing that the goal was to reach a point of stability, a place where the ground was solid enough that you could stop bracing for it to shift. She'd worked toward that the way you work toward something you believe in without having examined the belief too closely. What she understood now, sitting on this porch on this October evening with this man and this life and this view, was that the solid ground was not a destination. It was something you built under your own feet continuously, with whatever materials the day provided. You did not arrive at it. You made it and kept making it, and the making was the point. There were people in Redstone Valley right now who had food this winter because someone had thought ahead. Children who would read because someone had written letters to Ohio. A widow who had kept her land because someone had paid attention to a water access map. An old man who had kept his dignity and his hay because someone had understood the difference between pride and stubbornness. None of it was permanent. Any of it could be undone by the next winter, the next bad actor, the next thing nobody saw coming. But it had been built, and it was real, and it would last as long as the people tending it continued to tend it. She had come here with a worn suitcase and a few coins, and no particular plan except to find stable ground. What she'd found was something harder and better, the knowledge that stability was not given. It was built, daily, by people who showed up with what they had and decided without fanfare that what was in front of them was worth the effort. She had decided that. Every day, in small rooms and at kitchen tables, and in cold wagon rides and in conversations that mattered and some that only seemed to, she had decided it again. She was going to keep deciding it. "Come inside," Damien said, standing. "Horace is going to complain if we let dinner go cold." "Horace always complains," she said. "He does," he said, "but he's usually right." She stood, pulled her coat tight, looked one more time at the valley going dark under the early stars, the land enormous and indifferent, and also, somehow, entirely hers. Then she went inside. The fire was going. The house was warm. The table was set. She hung up her coat and sat down, and dinner began.